Hello, welcome back to the Phantom Diary channel. I'm sure there are many of you listening to my stories to fall asleep. Before we start, write in the comments what country you're listening from. So, let's go. It was a hot, quiet summer day when we decided to take the old boat out. My friends and I had grown up near the lake, and on weekends we'd usually head out to fish or just escape the dull routine of life. That day was supposed to be no different. We packed the boat with supplies, beer, snacks, and fishing gear, and set off. The lake stretched out before us, endless and still. The surface shimmered under the sun, and apart from the occasional call of a bird, there was nothing but silence. We didn't talk much, the kind of peace that comes from knowing each other so well. You don't always need to fill the quiet. We anchored the boat in the middle of the lake, far from the shore, where the water was deepest. We tossed our lines into the water and relaxed, letting the day stretch out before us. The surface of the water rippled gently, and I kept my eyes fixed on the horizon, letting my thoughts drift. It was one of those perfect summer afternoons. Hours passed. I'd started to doze off when something woke me, a faint, distant thud. I sat up, blinking into the sun. The others didn't seem to notice. The thud came again, faint but persistent, like something heavy being dragged across the water. I frowned and looked around, but the lake remained eerily still. I shook off my unease, convinced it was nothing more than my imagination. The water was calm, no signs of boats or other people in sight. I was about to lie back down when I noticed something. Just a ripple in the water. Something moving just beneath the surface. At first, I figured it was a fish or maybe even a log, but the more I watched, the more it seemed unnatural. It wasn't just a ripple, it was deliberate, as if something was swimming just beneath us, circling the boat. "Guys," I said, my voice quieter than I'd intended. They didn't respond, lost in their own world, fishing lines slack in the water. The thudding continued, now much louder, vibrating through the hull of the boat. I glanced down into the water again, heart pounding. The ripple grew closer. I saw something, just for a split second. Two dark shapes moving beneath the surface. Panic set in. I grabbed my phone, but there was no signal. The boat was silent except for the relentless thudding and the faint dragging sounds beneath us. The water seemed to grow darker, almost as if it were being pulled down into some unseen void. I had to wake my friends. "Guys, get up, something's wrong," I shouted, my voice trembling. They stirred, groggy but alert. I pointed toward the water, struggling to find words. My throat felt dry. "There's something down there. I don't know what it is, but it's not natural." They peered over the edge, eyes widening as they saw the dark shapes in the water. "What the hell is that?" one of them whispered. The thudding grew louder, and we could feel the vibrations in the floor of the boat. Something was approaching from beneath, something large. A chilling realization settled in my gut. Whatever it wasn't just a fish or a log. Panic swept through us. We didn't even bother pulling in our fishing lines. I grabbed the oars, and we frantically rowed toward the shore, the thudding and dragging noise growing louder, echoing beneath the surface. When we reached the shallower waters near the shore, the sounds stopped. The water became still again, unnaturally calm. We didn't look back, didn't dare. We made it home that day, shaken and silent. I've never been back to that lake. Whatever it was down there, whatever was dragging itself beneath the surface, I hope I never find out. It was an ordinary Saturday morning when my friends and I decided to take a trip out to an old lake, tucked away from civilization. We were looking for something remote, peaceful, a way to escape the noise of daily life. The drive was long, and as we got further from the city, the landscape changed from paved roads to dusty trails and towering trees. The lake itself was beautiful, serene, surrounded by dense forest. We'd read about it online, something about its still, clear waters and the promise of tranquility. The plan was simple. Hike around the lake, find a nice spot to set up camp, and spend the day swimming, fishing, and lounging by the shore. When we arrived, we were the only ones there. It felt like we had the entire lake to ourselves, the kind of solitude you only find when you're far away from everything. We unpacked our gear and set up camp, the sound of birds and the rustling of leaves the only things breaking the silence. As the sun dipped lower and the air cooled, we went to the shore to relax. The lake was calm, the water reflecting the orange glow of the sunset. We joked and laughed, tossing pebbles into the water, the sound echoing in the stillness of the woods. It was the kind of peace we'd all been craving. But that peace didn't last. It started with a noise, a distant, hollow thump. At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe it was an animal or just the wind carrying strange sounds from deeper in the forest. But as the evening wore on, the thumping became more distinct, more deliberate. It wasn't fading away either. It seemed to be getting closer. I glanced at my friends, their faces mirroring my unease. None of us said anything at first, not wanting to ruin the atmosphere. But the thumps persisted, and now I could hear something else. Soft whispers, barely audible, carried on the breeze. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. One of my friends, Sam, broke the silence. "Did you guys hear that?" We all nodded, uneasy. The sound was closer now. Too close. It wasn't just in the distance anymore. It was almost as if whatever was making those sounds was right there, just out of sight. We tried to convince ourselves it was probably an animal, maybe a deer or some other forest creature. But whatever it wasn't leaving. The thumping was steady, relentless, and the whispers felt like they were growing louder. "Let's go check it out," Sam suggested, his voice trembling slightly. None of us were particularly eager, but curiosity outweighed our fear. We gathered our flashlights and followed the sound deeper into the woods. The trees became denser, the air cooler, and the silence seemed to press in on us. The whispers were unmistakable now, low and guttural, spoken in a language I couldn't recognize. It was almost like they were speaking directly into my head, as if they knew I could hear them. Suddenly, the thumping stopped. The forest became eerily still again, and for a moment I thought we'd lost whatever had been making the noise. But then, just as I was about to speak, I heard it, the sound of footsteps. Not ours. These steps were slow, deliberate, and there were far too many of them. We stopped in our tracks, shining our flashlights into the trees, but there was nothing. No one there. Yet the footsteps continued, growing louder, as though they were circling us, closing in. Then, out of the corner of my flashlight beam, I saw them. Shadows, dozens of them, moving through the trees. They weren't human, not exactly. More like distorted shapes, figures with no faces, no features, just black voids where they should have been. They didn't run. They glided through the forest with an unnatural, fluid grace. We couldn't speak. We couldn't move. The shadows drew closer, closing the space between us. I could feel their presence, their gaze upon us, even though there was nothing to see. It was as if they were pulling us in, whispering promises of silence and darkness. The forest seemed to breathe, the trees swaying gently as if they too were part of whatever was watching us. I felt as though I was being drawn towards something beyond comprehension. Then, as suddenly as they appeared, the shadows vanished, leaving only silence. We stood there, frozen in place, the echoes of their whispers still ringing in my ears. It wasn't until we realized that the lake, once visible through the trees, was no longer in sight. We had wandered too far into the woods, far from where we had set up camp. Panic set in as we realized we were lost, but deep down, I knew whatever had followed us would never leave, at least not entirely. It was a bright, crisp autumn day when I decided to take a long drive out to the old orchard. My family had owned the farm for generations, and though most of the land had been sold off years ago, a small section of the orchard still remained untouched. I figured it would be a nice escape, a chance to walk among the ancient trees and clear my head. The old farmhouse stood at the edge of the orchard, weathered and forgotten. It wasn't much more than a shell these days, just some broken windows, faded paint, and a few scattered remnants of what had once been a thriving farm. I parked my car near the gravel road and made my way down the overgrown path toward the trees. The air was crisp and sharp, the smell of fallen leaves filling my nose. The trees were tall and gnarled, their branches stretching out like twisted fingers toward the sky. They had been planted long before I was born, and now they stood as silent witnesses to the passing of time. I wandered deeper into the orchard, my footsteps crunching over the leaves that blanketed the ground. The silence here was almost oppressive, broken only by the occasional rustling of branches or the distant call of a crow. I didn't feel afraid, just disconnected, like I was stepping into a memory that wasn't mine. After a while, I sat down under one of the trees, leaning back against the rough bark. The sun was beginning to dip lower on the horizon, casting long shadows across the rows of trees. I closed my eyes for a moment, soaking in the stillness. That's when I heard it. The faintest sound of footsteps, distant but unmistakable. My eyes snapped open and I strained to listen. The orchard was vast and empty, but the sound was there, just beyond the reach of my sight. It wasn't the wind or some natural noise. It was someone walking through the trees, slow and measured. I stood up, my stomach tightening, and began to walk toward the sound. The footsteps didn't stop, but they never seemed to get any closer either. I kept walking, trying to pinpoint their origin, but the trees twisted and stretched, concealing any clear view. Then I saw it. A figure, barely visible between the trees. A shape, tall and thin, moving just at the edge of my vision. I stopped, heart racing, and the figure seemed to pause as well. It tilted its head in my direction, and I could see its outline against the fading light. But there was something off about it, a sense of wrongness. I should have turned and run, but I couldn't move. The figure took a slow, deliberate step forward, and I could feel my breath quickening. It wasn't human, at least not entirely. Its features were too blurred, too indistinct, as though it were more shadow than flesh. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling. There was no response, only the sound of leaves rustling softly in the breeze. The figure seemed to drift closer, becoming more solid with each step, yet still somehow not quite there. A chill ran down my spine and I turned to run. My feet pounded against the ground as I pushed through the undergrowth, the sound of the footsteps behind me growing louder, closer. I could feel its presence gaining on me, breathing down my neck. I didn't stop until I reached the edge of the orchard where my car was parked. I fumbled for my keys, heart pounding as I threw the door open and climbed inside. The figure was nowhere to be seen, but I knew it was still out there, waiting. As I drove away from the old orchard, I kept glancing in my rearview mirror, half expecting to see that tall, shadowy figure following me. It never appeared, but the feeling of being watched never left. To this day, I can't shake the sense that something still lingers there, among those twisted trees, something waiting for me to return. It started as an ordinary weekend trip with a few friends. We'd decided to go hiking on a trail deep in the mountains. None of us had been there before, but the online reviews promised breathtaking views and quiet solitude, far from the noise of city life. The plan was simple: hike during the day, camp overnight, and return refreshed. But something about that trail didn't feel right from the start. The first few miles were beautiful. The air was crisp, the forest thick with towering pines, and the only sounds were birdsong and the crunch of gravel beneath our boots. We stopped often, marveling at the view as we climbed higher. The trail was marked clearly, and there were no other hikers around, which wasn't unusual given how secluded the place was. By midday, we were deep into the forest, far from any sign of civilization. It wasn't until we reached the fork in the trail that things started to feel strange. The sign was old and faded, barely legible. One path led to the summit, the other to a clearing near a river. We debated for a bit but decided to head toward the clearing. Something about the summit felt off. The clearing was beautiful. We set up camp there, unpacking our gear and gathering wood for a fire. The river ran nearby, its gentle sound soothing in the quiet. We were tired from the hike and settled into the camp, enjoying the peace and solitude. That night, around midnight, something woke me. It wasn't a sound, it was more like a shift in the atmosphere. The air had become heavier and the forest felt still, too still. I lay there, heart racing, listening. At first, there was nothing, just silence. Then I heard it. Soft footsteps. They weren't human footsteps. They were lighter, quicker, and moving in circles around our camp. I sat up, freezing, trying to make sense of the noise. The others were asleep, unaware of what was happening. I grabbed my flashlight, shining it toward the sound. Nothing. Just shadows moving beyond the reach of the beam. I stood, trying to calm myself, telling myself it was probably an animal. But as I scanned the clearing, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was out there wasn't driven by instinct. It was watching us. The footsteps grew closer, slower. They circled the camp like something was observing us from the trees. I could hear breathing, shallow and raspy, echoing through the stillness. My pulse thundered in my ears, and I backed away from the tent. That's when I saw it. Just a glimpse, but enough to make my blood run cold. A figure, tall and thin, standing at the edge of the clearing. Its face was obscured by the darkness, but its eyes, they glowed faintly, like dull embers. It didn't move, didn't approach, but I could feel its gaze locked on me. I stumbled backward, trying to wake my friends. My voice was hoarse as I called out, but they didn't stir. The figure remained, unmoving, as if frozen in place. I grabbed my phone, desperate to call for help, but there was no signal. My hands shook as I tried to think of what to do. That's when I noticed something strange. The trees. There were no shadows. Everything was bathed in a dim, unnatural light. The forest wasn't as dark as it should have been. The figure moved slightly, almost as if it had heard me, its silhouette more defined now. I didn't wait. Grabbing my pack, I ran for the river, heart pounding in my chest. The sound of my own footsteps echoed through the stillness, but I didn't dare look back. I followed the river, trying to escape whatever was behind me. Hours later, I stumbled into a small town, miles away from the trail. My clothes were torn, my legs scratched from running through the woods. I collapsed at the first building I saw, an old gas station, battered and out of breath. The clerk at the counter looked at me confused. "What happened?" he asked, his voice echoing in the empty space. I wanted to explain, to tell him about the figure, the footsteps, the silence. But no words would come. I never went back to the mountains, never hiked another trail. Sometimes, in the quiet of the night, I wonder if it's still out there, waiting. I had always loved nature, the quiet peace of being out in the open, surrounded by trees and distant mountains. One summer, my friends and I decided to spend the weekend hiking deep into a remote part of the forest. No cell service, no electricity, just us, the trail, and the wilderness. It sounded perfect, a chance to disconnect and escape the noise of the world. The hike started easy enough. The trail was narrow, winding through tall trees with sunlight filtering through the canopy. We made good time, laughing and sharing stories, taking occasional breaks to catch our breath. The deeper we went, the quieter it became. It wasn't the usual comforting silence of the forest. It was an unnatural stillness, as though the woods themselves were holding their breath. We reached a clearing and decided to set up camp. The sky was clear, the stars visible above us. The only sounds were the occasional rustling of leaves and the distant chirp of crickets. We built a fire, cooked some food, and enjoyed the peace. But something felt off. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. That night, as we lay in our sleeping bags, I heard it. A faint whisper, too quiet to make out, but it sent a shiver down my spine. I stayed still, pretending to be asleep, listening. It wasn't coming from any of my friends. The voices were too distant, too faint, but they seemed to be everywhere at once. I didn't say anything, hoping it was just my imagination. But when I woke the next morning, things had changed. The air felt heavier, colder. My friends noticed it too. There was a subtle shift in the atmosphere, something we couldn't quite explain. While my friends were packing up, I wandered off to explore. The woods had always been my escape, but today something felt different. I followed a narrow path deeper into the trees, drawn by a sense of curiosity and unease. The trees loomed over me, their branches twisted and gnarled, almost like they were watching. That's when I saw it. A figure standing perfectly still among the trees. It wasn't moving, just watching me. I froze, my heart thudding in my chest. It was hard to make out at first, but the longer I stared, the clearer it became. It was a tall, gaunt figure, its face partially obscured by the shadows of the forest. "Hello," I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. No response. The figure didn't move, didn't flinch. It just stood there, as if waiting. Panic set in. I turned to run, but my legs felt frozen, heavy. I couldn't look away. The figure remained unmoving, its presence so unnatural it made my skin crawl. Suddenly, I heard footsteps behind me, heavy and deliberate. I spun around, expecting one of my friends, but there was no one. The woods were silent again. I didn't wait to find out what was following me. I ran back to camp, heart racing. My friends were there, gathering our things. I didn't want to scare them, so I kept what I had seen to myself. We left the clearing and continued down the trail, but the feeling of being watched stayed with me. That night, as we made our way back to the car, I glanced over my shoulder, expecting to see something, anything in the shadows of the trees. But there was nothing. The forest had returned to its usual stillness. To this day, I don't know what I saw. A trick of the light, my mind playing tricks, or something else entirely. But the figure, the feeling of being watched, those are memories that will stay with me forever. It was supposed to be a quiet afternoon at home, the kind of day when the world slows down and you finally have a chance to relax, the kind of day you take for granted, never expecting anything unusual to happen. I live alone in a small apartment on the edge of town. It's nothing fancy, just a cramped place with thin walls and old wooden floors that creak underfoot. Most of my neighbors are long gone, or at least that's what it felt like. The quiet was almost deafening, only broken by the occasional car passing by on the distant road. That day, I decided to stay in and watch some old movies, something to distract me from the creeping sense of boredom. Around 3 p.m., I popped a DVD into the player and sank into the worn-out couch. The room was dim, the sunlight filtering through dusty blinds, casting long shadows across the floor. For a while, it was peaceful. I was lost in the flickering images on the screen when something made me glance toward the window. At first, I didn't see anything unusual. The street outside was still. No cars, no pedestrians. Just that unrelenting silence. But then, a faint movement caught my eye. It was barely noticeable, just a flicker at the edge of the glass. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. A figure. It wasn't standing still. No, it was shifting, pacing. Something tall and thin, too thin. Its form seemed distorted, almost like it wasn't fully there. The more I stared, the more I couldn't make sense of what I was seeing. It wasn't human. I wasn't even sure it was real. My gut told me to look away, but I couldn't. I was locked in place, unable to move, the figure growing clearer with each passing second. Its face, if it had one, was blank. Just an empty expanse where eyes should have been. It didn't blink, it didn't breathe. Then it tilted its head toward me, as if it could sense my gaze. My pulse quickened. I felt exposed, like it could see right through me. I wanted to look away, but my body wouldn't cooperate. I felt paralyzed by some invisible force. The figure raised one long, spindly arm, its fingers dragging against the glass. I could hear the faint scratch like nails on a chalkboard, but it wasn't loud. It was almost whispered. The sound reverberated in my head, filling the room with a sense of unbearable dread. Tears stung my eyes, but I couldn't tear my gaze away. The figure moved closer to the window, its form bending, folding in strange, unnatural ways. Its steps were slow, deliberate, as if it were studying me. The closer it got, the less it resembled anything human. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it stopped. Its head tilted even farther, as if inspecting me from afar. I could feel its gaze burrowing into my soul. It didn't blink, didn't move. Time seemed to stretch. My breath was shallow, my hands trembling. The silence in the room had become oppressive, like a heavy weight pressing down on me. Then it spoke, or rather, it didn't. I heard no words, no sound at all, but somehow I understood what it was saying. The message was clear. You can't escape. In that moment, I felt something shift inside me. The figure didn't need to speak. It wasn't just standing there. It had crossed over somehow, into my world. It knew I couldn't run. I could feel its presence in my very bones, a suffocating, malignant force that had no intention of leaving. I knew, without a doubt, that it was watching me, waiting. I don't know how long I sat there. Hours, maybe. Eventually, the figure retreated, vanishing into the shadows. The silence remained, but the sense of its presence lingered, like a breath on my neck. I never saw it again, but I know it's still there, waiting. I had always been fascinated by the old house at the end of the street. It was a place I passed every day on my way home from school, its faded, peeling paint and overgrown yard standing out from the otherwise ordinary suburban neighborhood. No one lived there, or at least no one who was ever seen. The house seemed to exist in a quiet, unsettling limbo, untouched by time. One day, I found myself walking past it again, the sun sinking low behind the horizon. Curiosity got the better of me, and before I knew it, I found myself at the front gate. The rusted hinges creaked as I pushed it open, the weight of years shifting as the gate groaned in protest. I stepped into the yard, the grass crunching beneath my feet. The house loomed in front of me, its windows dark and lifeless. I had always heard stories about that house, whispers of strange sounds, of lights that flickered in the night, of shadows that moved in the windows when no one was supposed to be there. But I never believed in such things, at least not until that day. I approached the front door, the air thick with dust and the faint smell of decay. I placed my hand on the doorknob, but it didn't turn. The door was locked. I sighed, feeling a twinge of disappointment, and stepped back. But then I noticed something. Movement from one of the upstairs windows. A shadow, shifting, just for a moment. It wasn't the wind. It was too deliberate, too human. My heart began to race. I told myself it was probably just a trick of the light, something my mind conjured up in the dim twilight. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching me. Despite my better judgment, I approached the side of the house, creeping closer to a window that was partially cracked open. The boards covering it were old and warped, barely hanging on. I pressed my face to the opening, peering inside. The room beyond was dark, but I could make out the outlines of furniture, ancient, covered in dust. A faint glimmer of something metallic caught my eye, resting on a table. Suddenly, a low creak echoed from somewhere inside the house, and I jumped back, heart pounding. My breath quickened as I stepped away from the window, the realization hitting me that I wasn't alone. The silence seemed to stretch, heavy and oppressive, pressing down on me. I had to get out, but just as I turned to leave, I heard a faint whisper, barely audible, as if it was coming from inside the house. Stay. I froze, my blood running cold. The whisper wasn't a voice I recognized. It wasn't human. It was hollow, almost robotic, like something long forgotten had spoken from beyond the grave. A shiver ran down my spine. My feet felt frozen to the ground. I wanted to run, but something kept me rooted in place. The whisper came again, louder this time. Stay. I clenched my fists, forcing myself to take a step back. I wanted to scream, but my voice felt caught in my throat. My mind was screaming at me to leave, but my body wouldn't move. I could feel the air grow heavier, darker, as though the house itself had become alive, watching me, waiting. Then, just as suddenly as the whispers had started, they stopped. The silence was deafening. I waited, my heart racing, my breaths shallow, trying to convince myself it was over. I turned, finally running, sprinting down the street, my mind replaying the voice in my head. I never went back to that house. To this day, I still wonder what was in there, what was waiting. But some things are better left untouched, hidden away, behind doors that should never be opened. It was the last day of my trip to the mountains. I had spent the past week hiking, exploring remote trails, and basking in the beauty of nature. No phone signal, no distractions, just the sound of the wind through the trees and the occasional rustle of leaves. It was peaceful, at least during the day. On my final evening, I decided to take one last walk down to a secluded pond deep in the forest. The air was cool, and the sky was a deep, inky black. The trees stretched high above, casting long shadows that made it feel like the world was shrinking around me. The walk to the pond wasn't long, but it was quiet. Too quiet. I could feel the isolation, the stillness pressing against my chest. It felt as though the world had been hushed just for me. I reached the pond, which glimmered under the dim light of the stars reflecting off the water. I sat down on a rock, letting out a long breath. As I stared into the still pond, something shifted in the water's surface. A ripple formed, spreading outward in slow waves. I leaned in closer, my reflection breaking apart with each wave. But then something else appeared, something underneath the surface. At first, it looked like just another reflection, distorted by the ripples. But then I saw it. Two pale, lifeless eyes staring back at me from the depths. I stumbled back from the water, my breath catching in my throat. My heart pounded in my chest as I watched those eyes slowly rise from the depths. The figure emerged slowly, its movements awkward, unnatural. It was pale, its skin wrinkled and damp like it had been submerged for years. But it wasn't just a reflection, it was real. The figure didn't step fully out of the water. It hovered just above the surface, those hollow eyes still locked onto mine. I wanted to scream, but no sound came. I stumbled backward, my feet slipping on the loose dirt. The figure didn't move, didn't chase me, but its gaze never wavered. I ran, heart racing, lungs burning with every step. The forest around me seemed alive, the trees stretching their branches toward the ground like clawed hands. I didn't stop until I was back at my campsite, my chest heaving. The echo of those hollow eyes burned into my mind. The next morning, I returned to the pond one last time, but there was nothing there, just the still water and the empty forest. Whatever I saw, whatever that thing was gone. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still watching me, hidden somewhere deep in the shadows of the woods. I'll never forget the night it happened. It wasn't the kind of place where you'd expect anything strange, just an ordinary apartment complex on the outskirts of town. My roommate, Anna, and I had lived there for about a year, always keeping to ourselves, never believing in anything supernatural. That night, I stayed up late scrolling through my phone while Anna had already gone to bed. The building was quiet, except for the faint sound of creaking floors as people moved around in neighboring apartments. I didn't think much of it until I heard something coming from inside my closet. At first, I assumed it was just the usual settling of the building, old pipes, settling walls, creaking floorboards. But the sound didn't stop. It was slow, deliberate, like someone shifting inside the closet, dragging something along the floor. I set my phone down and sat up, listening. The sound was coming from the back of the closet, from deep within. My pulse quickened as I imagined what could be inside. I stood up, my feet making soft thuds on the worn carpet, and walked toward the closet. The door creaked open as I pulled it back. I didn't know what I expected, but it wasn't what I saw. Nothing but old clothes and random boxes stacked in the corner. I sighed, relieved but still uneasy, and pulled the closet door shut again. As I turned to head back to bed, something caught my eye. A faint shadow flickering at the edge of the doorframe. I froze, staring at it, trying to convince myself it was just a trick of the light. But the shadow lingered, unmoving. I wanted to dismiss it, but something wasn't right. Slowly, I stepped closer, my heart thudding in my chest. I reached out and touched the doorframe, but there was nothing there. Then, from inside the apartment came a whisper. It was faint at first, so soft I almost convinced myself it was in my head. "Let me out." I spun around, my breath catching. The whisper had come from the direction of the closet, but there was no one there. My hands trembled as I forced myself to look back at the closet door. It was still shut, but I could feel the presence of whatever, or whoever, was on the other side. The whisper came again, this time louder, more insistent. "Let me out." I wanted to scream, but no sound came. My legs moved involuntarily toward the closet. I wasn't in control anymore, as if something had taken over my body. I stood there, staring at the door, trying to process what I was hearing. Then, with a burst of courage I didn't know I had, I threw open the closet door. Nothing, just empty clothes and old boxes. My heart pounded in my ears as I stared into the abyss of the dark closet. But it wasn't empty. I could feel it, like someone, or something, was watching me from within. I slammed the door shut, my hands trembling. I backed away, unable to take my eyes off the closet. The whisper was still there, though it had softened like it was retreating but not quite gone. I didn't sleep that night. Every creak of the building, every shuffle of a neighbor in the hall, felt like it was pointing right to me. The next morning, I couldn't bring myself to look inside the closet again. I told Anna what happened, but she didn't believe me. Still, that night, and every night after, when I closed my eyes, I could still hear the whisper, "Let me out." It started with a simple drive. I had always been fascinated by old lighthouses, drawn to their solitude and the stories they seemed to hold. So, one weekend, I decided to take a trip to an isolated one perched on a cliff by the sea. It was something I'd always wanted to do, something to escape from the noise of daily life. The lighthouse was miles away from any town or signs of human life. The drive to get there was long, winding through narrow, desolate roads with nothing but trees and rocky cliffs on either side. The closer I got, the more the world seemed to shrink. By the time I arrived, the sun had begun to set, casting a long, eerie glow over the water below. The lighthouse stood tall, its white paint peeling and windows dark. The air smelled of salt and brine, and the only sound was the crashing waves below. I parked my car and began the short hike up the steep path leading to the base of the lighthouse. The only other thing besides the distant roar of the sea was the silence that seemed to engulf everything. When I reached the entrance, I pushed open the heavy wooden door. The inside was musty and cold, with narrow, spiraling stairs leading to the top. Each step groaned beneath my feet as I climbed. It wasn't long before I reached the top, where the view was breathtaking. The sea stretched out before me, endless and unforgiving. I stood there, lost in the beauty of it all, when something made me glance back toward the stairs. For a moment, I thought I saw someone standing there, silhouetted against the narrow frame of the doorway. My stomach twisted, and my heart skipped a beat. But when I turned fully around, there was no one there. I told myself it was just the shadows playing tricks. The wind whistled through the small broken windows, and I shivered, forcing the creeping unease to the back of my mind. As I took in the view again, I thought about the stories of ships lost at sea, the lonely keepers who had watched from these towers for generations. The idea of isolation felt comforting until I realized that I wasn't alone. Not truly. There was something off about the silence, the absence of birds, the usual sounds of life. Everything was too still, the kind of silence that made your ears ring. I made my way back down the stairs, each creak of the wood beneath me echoing. When I reached the bottom, the door was shut. How had I not noticed that before? The door hadn't moved on its own. My heart raced again as I reached for the handle, only to find it locked from the inside. I was trapped. Panic hit me hard. I checked my phone, but there was no signal. The lighthouse stood in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by nothing but ocean and cliffs. I tried to open the door, banging on it, shouting for help, but there was no one around. The sound of my own voice felt hollow in the empty space. I spent what felt like hours trying to find a way out, but the door refused to budge. It was as if something had sealed it behind me, something I couldn't see or understand. The fear grew, sinking into every part of me. The thought that I might be trapped here, in this ancient lighthouse where the echoes of the past lingered, was too much to bear. When I finally slumped to the floor, exhausted and hopeless, I noticed something strange. The silence seemed to have shifted. Not just quiet, it was as if the world itself had grown quieter. The air was still, heavy, as though time had stopped. I closed my eyes, trying to steady my breathing, when I heard it. The faint sound of a distant bell, soft and low. It wasn't coming from inside the lighthouse. It was from the sea. The bell rang again, louder this time. It echoed off the cliffs, and I couldn't tell if it was real or some strange, haunting memory. My stomach turned as I realized there was no ship in sight, no boat or rescue, just the sound of a bell calling from the void. Trembling, I stood up and went to the window, pressing my face against the cold glass. Below, far out on the water, I saw a flicker of light, dim, almost ghostly. It moved closer, but the lighthouse had no boats or ships. No life should have been out there. I forced myself to look away, but the bell continued, growing louder and more insistent. I didn't know if it was real or if my mind was playing tricks, but I knew one thing. The lighthouse wasn't just keeping watch over the sea. It felt like the sea was watching me. I never saw anyone outside, never found a way out, but the bell still echoes in my mind, always just out of reach. I don't know if anyone else heard it or if I was the only one who ever would. It was supposed to be just an ordinary day at home. The house sat on the outskirts of a small town, surrounded by open fields and woods that stretched for miles in every direction. I lived alone, but I wasn't one to feel uneasy about the quiet, isolated life. At least, I wasn't until that day. The morning started off normal, just another day of cleaning, catching up on emails, and preparing for the usual chores. But something about the air felt off. It wasn't heavy or oppressive, just different. I shook it off, attributing it to the weather. Maybe the storm they'd predicted was finally rolling in. Around noon, the rain began, soft at first, but growing stronger by the hour. I watched it from the kitchen window, sipping my coffee. The sky was a thick, dull gray, and everything beyond the yard blurred under the falling sheets. I didn't think much of it until I heard the knock. It came softly at first, 3 quick raps on the front door. I froze, my coffee halfway to my lips. The knocking came again, a bit louder this time, persistent, but no one ever showed themselves. I told myself it was probably just someone needing shelter from the storm. Maybe a neighbor, though no one I recognized. I stood in front of the door, heart hammering, and cracked it open just a little. No one was there. I peered outside into the rain, but the porch was empty. There was no one around, just the relentless downpour and the empty, soaking fields beyond. I checked the locks and decided to ignore it. Must have been my imagination, I told myself. Storms can mess with your head. I went back to the living room. the chill of the rain beginning to seep into my bones. The windows fogged up as the rain continued to fall harder. The noise outside grew louder, the steady pitter-patter of droplets becoming a relentless pounding. It was soothing in a way, like the world was washing away everything around me. Hours passed. I lost track of time, engrossed in some half-read book, when a sudden noise made my blood run cold. A slow, scraping sound came from the back of the house, faint but deliberate, like something dragging across the floor. My stomach clenched and I sat there, frozen, waiting. The scraping grew louder. It wasn't coming from the window or the door, but from deeper inside the house. The kind of sound that made you wonder how something could even move like that. I tried to convince myself it was the wind, maybe some loose shutter flapping against the wall, but the wind doesn't scrape like that. I grabbed a flashlight from the drawer and moved cautiously toward the source of the noise. Each step felt heavier, each breath quieter. The scraping continued, rhythmic, unnerving. I reached the hallway leading to the back of the house and shined my light down the dark corridor. That's when I saw it. A figure hunched over and shuffling, moving towards the kitchen. Its back was grotesquely twisted and its arms were far too long, dragging along the floor. I couldn't make out a face, just dark voids where eyes should have been, and something glistening at the corners of its mouth. Panic surged through me, but I didn't scream. I couldn't move. My legs refused to obey, frozen in place as the thing advanced. The scraping stopped, replaced by a low, raspy breathing that seemed to echo through the house. Then it stopped. Just as suddenly as it had appeared, I could feel its presence just a few feet away, as if it had paused, waiting for something. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat echoing through the quiet. Who's there? I managed to whisper, but my voice barely escaped. Silence. Another long minute passed, the air thick with dread. I couldn't hear anything but the sound of my own breathing and the relentless rain outside. Slowly, cautiously, I backed away, retracing my steps. The figure never followed. I didn't hear it leave. But when I checked the back door, the lock was undone. I didn't sleep that night, clutching my phone tightly, waiting for dawn. The storm raged on, but whatever had been there, watching, had never come back. I remember the night clearly, even though I wish I didn't. It wasn't like a typical horror story where something obvious happens and you can't look away. No, this was different. A quiet, unsettling terror that crept in slowly, unnoticed, until it was already too late. It started with an evening trip. A group of us decided to go for a hike up an old, abandoned mountain trail that no one in town really talked about anymore. The path was barely visible through the trees, and we figured it'd be fun to explore something that felt off the map. No one else had been there in years, from what we'd heard. The trail wasn't difficult at first, just some rocky terrain and patches of overgrown bushes. But as we kept walking deeper into the forest, something felt off. The air seemed thick, heavier. The usual sounds of chirping crickets and rustling leaves were replaced by a strange, oppressive silence. Even the forest itself felt strange, like it was watching us. We had been hiking for what felt like hours when we came across a clearing, a wide space surrounded by towering pines. There was an old, crumbling structure at the center of the clearing. It looked like a small, forgotten cabin, its roof partially caved in, and the walls worn with age. None of us had expected to find something like this out here. It looked abandoned, but something about it felt wrong. "We should check it out," one of my friends, Mark, said, stepping toward the cabin. The others hesitated, but curiosity got the better of us. The closer we got, the more uneasy I became. The silence seemed to thicken, as though the forest itself had swallowed all sound. The door of the cabin creaked open under our weight, revealing a room filled with dust-covered furniture and remnants of something long forgotten. We stepped inside, hesitant, but everything seemed still. There was nothing alive inside except for us. As we poked around, one of my friends, Laura, pointed out something strange. The walls were covered in old faded drawings. Children's drawings, but they weren't the usual cheerful, innocent sketches. These were distorted, eerie, figures with hollow eyes, twisted shapes, and scribbled faces that seemed to stare at us from the faded paper. "That's creepy," Mark said, turning pale. We quickly decided to leave, but as we stepped outside, the feeling of unease only deepened. It wasn't just the creepy drawings or the old decaying cabin. It was something else. A presence. It wasn't threatening, but there was an undeniable sense that we weren't supposed to be there. We moved quickly through the woods, trying to shake the sense of discomfort that had settled over us. The trail became steeper, harder to follow as we pressed on, and the oppressive silence grew even thicker. Then, as we were about to turn back, we heard it, the soft sound of footsteps behind us. But there was no one there. "Guys, stop," I whispered, turning around. The others froze. "I hear it too," Laura said, her voice barely above a whisper. The footsteps echoed faintly in the distance, like someone, or something, was walking just beyond the tree line, following us. We hurried, but the sounds seemed to be growing closer, as though whatever was following us was keeping pace. No matter how far we went, the noise remained, distant but persistent. We couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. As we finally reached the trailhead, we stopped, breathing heavily. The trees loomed around us, shadows stretching long in the fading light. That's when I realized something was missing. One of my friends, Emma, was gone. "Where's Emma?" I asked, my voice trembling. The others looked at each other, panic setting in. We split up, calling her name, but the only response was silence. The woods had swallowed her, leaving us alone once again. We couldn't find Emma. We never did. She was just gone. There was no trace of her, no sign of where she might have gone. The forest had taken her, and we were too afraid to go back in and search again. To this day, I can't explain what happened that night. All I know is that something was in those woods, something that watched us, followed us, and took Emma. And whatever it was, I'm convinced it's still out there, waiting. I'll never forget that night. It started like any other. My friends and I decided to take a late-night trip to the old observatory on the outskirts of town. It wasn't something we normally did, but curiosity got the better of us. The observatory was an eerie place, abandoned for years, surrounded by forests that seemed to go on forever. When we arrived, everything felt different from the start. The building had a sense of stillness that wasn't natural. It wasn't like the quiet of the woods. It was more oppressive, more unnatural. The air felt heavy, as if something was watching, waiting. We approached the gate that led to the entrance, its iron bars creaking as we pushed through. The windows were shattered, the roof caved in on one side. The place looked ancient, like it had been forgotten for decades. We ventured inside, flashlights flickering as we made our way through the dust-covered rooms. The once magnificent observatory was now a hollow shell, debris strewn across the floor and old telescopes covered in cobwebs. The silence felt deafening, the kind that makes your skin crawl, like the forest had swallowed everything whole. As we made our way deeper, I noticed something strange. There was no sound at all, not even from the forest beyond. No rustling leaves, no distant animal calls, nothing. It was as if the whole world had stopped. We found our way to the control room, the only part of the building that still had some semblance of structure. The faded, old star maps hung from the walls, their bright colors now faded and cracked. It was eerie, standing in a place that was once alive with science, now abandoned and lifeless. That's when we noticed something wasn't right. The flicker of our flashlights cast distorted shadows on the walls. It felt like the shadows were shifting, moving in ways they shouldn't. I turned to ask my friend what he thought, but when I spoke, my voice barely came out. It was as if the very air had swallowed it. Something felt off. My heartbeat thudded in my ears as I scanned the room. And that's when I saw it, just for a fleeting moment. a figure in the corner. It was tall and thin, with hollow eyes that seemed to absorb the light. It didn't move, but I could feel it watching, waiting. I blinked, thinking I was imagining things, but when I looked again, it was gone. We kept exploring, trying to shake the feeling of unease. My friend checked the broken telescope, pointing the lens toward the sky. "It's jammed," he said, fumbling with the controls. Then he gasped. The sky through the lens wasn't what it should have been. The stars, usually so distant and infinite, were distorted, twisted, flickering as if they weren't really there. A strange hum began to fill the room, subtle at first, but growing louder. "What's happening?" my friend whispered. I didn't know what to say. The hum grew into a low, almost mechanical vibration, and the air seemed to thicken, pressing down on us harder. It was like the world was bending, as though we were seeing something we weren't supposed to. That's when I noticed it again. That figure, tall, pale, and unnervingly still, was back, standing just at the edge of the room. This time, its face was visible. It wasn't human. Its eyes weren't empty but filled with something ancient, something malevolent. It didn't move, but I could feel its presence, as if it had always been there. The hum grew louder, almost deafening now. I could feel my ears popping, the vibrations reverberating through my chest. I turned to my friends, but they were gone, vanished without a trace. I was alone. Panic surged through me as I realized I couldn't move, couldn't speak. The figure was closer now, standing right in front of me, its eyes boring into mine. And then, just as quickly as everything had started, the hum stopped. The world went silent again. I blinked, shaking, and found myself back in the control room. My friends were there, looking at me, their faces pale. They were talking, asking if I was okay, but I couldn't hear a word. It was as if the silence had returned with a vengeance. We left the observatory in silence, no one speaking of what we had seen. I glanced back at the building one last time, the distant trees now swaying, as if something unseen was moving just beyond the edge of the woods. I'll never forget those hollow eyes, the hum, and the silence. Whatever it was, it's still out there, waiting. I had always loved the quiet solitude of the forest. Growing up, I would spend hours walking through the trees, lost in my thoughts, letting the sounds of nature calm my mind. But that day, something felt different, off in a way I couldn't explain. It was mid-afternoon when I decided to take a long hike. The weather was perfect, warm, sunny, with only a gentle breeze rustling the leaves. I parked my car at the edge of the trailhead and started walking, following the familiar path that twisted deeper into the woods. The forest felt vast and peaceful, as it always did, but today there was a strange stillness. No birdsong, no rustling leaves, just silence that seemed unnatural. After about an hour, I came to a clearing, a large, flat expanse of moss-covered ground surrounded by towering trees. I decided to stop there and rest for a while. I lay back on a bed of soft grass, staring up at the sky through the canopy of leaves. As I lay there, I noticed something strange. The sounds of the forest had stopped entirely. Not just birds, but everything. It was as if the entire world had gone silent. My heart began to pound as I sat up and looked around. The air felt heavy, like something was looming just beyond my view. I stood and started walking again, though my sense of peace was gone. The silence wasn't just unnerving, it felt wrong. I felt like something was watching me, like the forest wasn't supposed to be this quiet. My footsteps became quicker, my breathing faster. Hours seemed to pass, though I wasn't sure how much time had actually gone by. The sun was setting now, casting long shadows across the forest floor. I knew I needed to turn back, but the sense of unease only grew stronger. As I walked, I came to a narrow footbridge over a shallow creek. I hesitated before stepping onto it, the creaking wood beneath my feet making me pause. The water below was eerily still, almost too still. I looked down into the water, but there was nothing there. No fish, no movement at all. The reflection staring back at me wasn't quite right either, distorted as if the water itself was not quite real. It wasn't until I reached the other side that I realized how quiet the creek had been. There wasn't even the sound of flowing water. I shook my head, trying to push away the sense of dread that was creeping up on me. The trees seemed to close in around me as I continued walking. I could feel the weight of the forest pressing against my shoulders, the stillness pressing into my ears. It wasn't just quiet. It felt like something was missing from the world. The forest wasn't supposed to feel this way, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was no longer alone. I began to run, though my legs ached. My breath came in ragged gasps. The forest around me seemed to blur, the shadows twisting and shifting unnaturally. I wasn't sure if it was my fear playing tricks on me or if something was actually happening. And then, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, I heard it, a soft, raspy whisper, closer than I expected. My legs locked up, my body frozen as I stood there in the dark, unable to move. The whisper repeated itself, louder now, closer, like someone or something was right behind me. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. My mind screamed for me to run, but my body refused to obey. The whisper stopped, but the silence that followed was even more deafening. I felt a chill run down my spine, as if the very air had grown colder. I could hear footsteps now, slow, deliberate, just behind me. I didn't dare look back. Every instinct screamed at me to move, but I stood there, trembling. It wasn't until the whisper returned, right next to my ear, that I broke free from the paralysis. I bolted down the trail, my legs moving as fast as they could carry me. The trees blurred past in a chaotic rush, my breath ragged, lungs burning. I didn't stop until I broke through the tree line and saw my car in the distance. I fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking, but I didn't look back. I didn't stop running until I was safely inside, the engine roaring to life beneath me. As I drove away from the forest, I realized that I didn't know what had followed me, or why, but something had, and it still felt like it was out there, somewhere in the woods, waiting. I still can't forget that night in the abandoned subway station. It was supposed to be a routine trip home after a long day, but everything felt off from the moment I stepped onto the platform. I had just missed the last train, so I found myself alone in the dim light of the old station. The air was thick with dust, the kind of silence that feels almost oppressive. There wasn't a soul in sight, and even the usual sounds of distant trains were absent. The station had a strange, heavy atmosphere, as though the city itself had forgotten about it. I sat down on the platform bench, my phone dimming as I glanced at it. No signal. I sighed, slipping it back into my pocket. That's when I noticed the flickering lights. The fluorescent bulbs hummed and flickered, casting distorted shadows that danced across the tiles. The whole place felt like it was slipping into another dimension. Time passed, or at least it felt like it did. The stillness stretched on and the silence grew deeper. Then I heard something, a soft, dragging noise echoing from somewhere deeper into the station. It was slow, uneven, like someone was shuffling along the tiles. I froze, straining my ears. The sound grew louder, closer. I should have left, but something kept me there, my fear rooted in place. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. Then I saw it, a figure. It was tall, gaunt, and moving with a jerky, unnatural gait. Its face was obscured by a shadow, but I could see the unsettling way it tilted its head as if listening. The closer it came, the more I realized its footsteps didn't match any human pattern. They were uneven, like someone dragging something heavy behind them. I wanted to scream, but my throat was locked in place. I couldn't look away as the figure got closer. It wasn't until it was right in front of me that I saw it, a faint, hollow glow where its eyes should have been. The smell hit me first, something rotten and metallic. The silence broke into a low, distorted whisper, like the sound of something ancient and wrong. "Leave! It rasped, its voice sounding almost mechanical. "Not supposed to be here." In that moment, every instinct in my body screamed to run, but when I turned to flee, my legs buckled beneath me. The creature was gone, vanished like a memory. The subway station was still and empty once more, the lights flickering as though nothing had ever happened. I got up and made my way to the edge of the platform, my heart thudding in my chest. I didn't look back, and I didn't stop until I reached the safety of my home. Even now, I wonder what I saw that night, and whether it's still waiting for someone else to stumble into the darkness. I'll never forget that day. It started out ordinary enough. My friends and I decided to take a spontaneous trip to the nearby lake. We weren't expecting anything out of the ordinary, just a few hours of peace, some fishing, and maybe a swim if we felt like it. Nothing seemed unusual as we packed up and drove down the winding dirt road leading to the lake. We'd been going to this spot for years. It was remote, surrounded by trees and hills, with no cell service and few visitors, the kind of place where you could truly get away from everything. When we arrived, the sun was high in the sky, and the lake shimmered under its light. We set up a small camp by the shore, blankets, coolers filled with drinks, and a fishing line tossed into the water. It was the kind of day where you lose track of time, relaxing in the warm sun. But as the afternoon wore on, the atmosphere began to shift. The first sign came when we noticed the birds went quiet. The chirping had gradually died down, but we didn't think much of it. It wasn't until we glanced up at the sky that something truly strange happened. The clouds seemed to darken, even though the sun was still shining brightly. It was as if the world had turned gray for a moment, without warning. I looked around, feeling a knot of discomfort form in my stomach. My friends were laughing, oblivious, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I wandered a bit away from the camp, standing at the edge of the water, staring out into the lake. That's when I saw it, a figure, standing at the far side of the lake. It wasn't moving, just standing there as though it were staring directly at me. I told myself it had to be a trick of the light or someone from a distant campsite. But no one ever came to this part of the lake. The figure was still too far away for me to make out any details, but the sensation of being watched deepened. I called out to my friends, trying to shake off the unease. They didn't hear me. Or if they did, they didn't seem concerned. I didn't want to ruin the day with my paranoia, so I pushed the feeling aside. It wasn't until later that evening, when we were sitting around the campfire, that things got worse. The air had grown colder, the sun long set, leaving us with only the dim glow of the fire. The quiet was now oppressive, a stillness that felt unnatural. It wasn't like the calm of nature, it was like something had swallowed the sounds of the night. No crickets, no rustling leaves, just silence. We talked, but the conversation felt forced, the laughter awkward. I kept glancing over my shoulder, feeling eyes on me. I couldn't explain it, but the feeling of being watched was unbearable. Every time I looked around, I saw nothing but trees and darkness. Then, from out of nowhere, we heard it. Soft, distorted whispers. They weren't coming from any direction. It was as if they surrounded us, echoing in the stillness. I strained to make out the words, but whatever was being said was too faint, too unnatural. I couldn't bring myself to ignore it anymore. "Did you guys hear that?" I asked, my voice shaky. They shook their heads, looking at me like I was imagining things. But then I saw it again, the figure, much closer now. It was standing at the edge of the trees, watching us. It was too dark to make out any features, only the faint silhouette, almost human, but not quite. The whispering intensified, as if the figure was breathing the sound into the air. Panic set in. I felt the cold rush through my veins, and my body trembled uncontrollably. I tried to call out again, but no words would come. The figure moved a step closer. It wasn't walking. It glided, as if pulled by some unseen force. The whispers stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. I felt my friends tugging at my arm, pulling me toward the campfire, but I couldn't take my eyes off the figure. It felt like whatever this thing was, it had me trapped. My friends didn't see it, didn't hear the whispers. They told me to snap out of it, convinced I was just spooked by the isolation. But then something happened that I'll never forget. The figure, which had been standing still for what felt like forever, suddenly turned and disappeared into the trees. One moment it was there, and the next, gone, like it had never existed. I tried to explain to my friends what I saw, what I felt, but they couldn't see it. The whispers returned for a brief moment, distant and faint. And then, just like before, silence. I've never been able to return to that lake. To this day, I don't know what I saw or what it wanted. All I know is that something was there, something that wasn't human, and no one else ever saw it. It was a calm afternoon, the kind where the heat seems to bend the air. My friends and I decided to take a trip to the local beach, a place we'd visited many times before, but something felt different this time. The sun glared down from a cloudless sky as we pulled into the empty parking lot. The beach wasn't far, just a short walk from the car, but there were fewer people than usual. We set up our towels and chairs, laughing as we dove into the cool water. The waves were gentle, the kind you don't think twice about. For a while, it felt like nothing could go wrong. We swam, played around, and enjoyed the simplicity of the day. It wasn't until later, when the sun was starting to dip, casting long shadows across the shore, that things began to feel off. We were sitting on the sand, watching the horizon, when one of my friends suddenly pointed toward the water. "There's something out there," she said, her voice quieter than before. At first, I didn't see anything, just the vast expanse of blue stretching out to meet the sky. But as my eyes adjusted, I began to make out a figure far in the distance. It wasn't a person, not a swimmer or a surfer. It looked almost like a shadow, dark and indistinct, moving slowly beneath the surface. The water didn't ripple in the way waves normally do. It was as if something was swimming just beneath, something large, something unnatural. "Is it a shark?" one of my friends asked, but none of us could answer. We all stood there staring at the spot where the figure had been, but now it was gone. The beach had become unnervingly quiet, save for the faint lapping of the waves. The sun had all but disappeared, replaced by a faint orange glow on the horizon. It was beautiful in an eerie way, but none of us could shake the feeling that something was off. "We should go," someone said. The idea of walking back to the car felt like a relief, but we couldn't shake the unease. The path back to the parking lot was dark and desolate, lined with dunes on one side and endless ocean on the other. The air felt thick, heavier than before, and we walked in silence. Halfway back, we stopped. There was a sound, something faint but unmistakable. A splash, not far from the shore. It echoed in the quiet evening air. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. We stood there, frozen, straining to hear anything else, but it was as if the world had gone still. No wind, no birds, just the faint sound of the waves. Then came the whispering. It started softly at first, almost like the wind, but we realized there wasn't any wind. It was a voice, or rather, many voices, whispers carried on the breeze. They were faint and incomprehensible, as if they were speaking in a language we couldn't understand. Panic gripped me. I could feel it in the way my heart pounded in my chest. We weren't alone. Something was out there, watching us, waiting. "We need to get back now," one of my friends said, her voice trembling. As we hurried to the car, the whispers grew louder, surrounding us. It was as though the entire beach was alive, breathing, and the sound of those whispers seemed to come from everywhere. I kept turning, scanning the dunes and the water, but saw nothing. Yet the voices remained, growing more insistent, more sinister. We finally made it to the car, fumbling with the keys, heartbeats thudding in our ears. The moment we slammed the doors shut, the whispers stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. Driving away, we didn't speak much. All I could think about was that figure beneath the water, the whispers that seemed to follow us, and how wrong the beach had felt. When I glanced back, the beach was gone, swallowed by the darkness. Whatever we saw that day, it's still out there, waiting. It was a quiet evening at home, the kind where the city seems to slow down, and all I could hear was the distant hum of cars passing by. The apartment building where I lived was old, with creaky floorboards and thin walls. I lived on the 4th floor, in a corner unit with windows that looked out over a row of old, weathered rooftops. I was sitting on the couch, engrossed in a book, when I heard the soft, repetitive tapping at my window. At first, I assumed it was just the wind, but when I glanced up, I realized there was no wind. It was perfectly still outside. The tapping continued, slow and deliberate, like someone or something was trying to get my attention. I hesitated, my stomach twisting in knots. The apartment felt too quiet now, too still. I didn't want to move, but curiosity got the better of me. I stood slowly, tiptoeing toward the window. I pressed my face to the glass. Below me, in the alley between buildings, there was a figure. It stood completely still, staring up at my window. At first, I couldn't make out much. It was dark, and my view wasn't clear. But then, the figure moved closer, shuffling forward in a slow, unnatural way. Its movements were mechanical, jerky, as if it wasn't fully human. Panic set in as I realized its face was partially obscured, but I could still see the eyes. Empty, hollow, and void of life. They seemed to stare right through me, past the glass. I took a step back from the window, my heart hammering in my chest. The tapping stopped. Silence followed except for my own breathing. I stood frozen, staring at the spot where the figure had been. Nothing moved, no sounds from outside. I didn't dare turn away from the window. Minutes passed, but the figure didn't move again. I was about to force myself to look away when, suddenly, the lights flickered. The entire room went dark for a brief second, and when they came back on, the figure was gone. I didn't sleep that night. The day had been perfect. We set out in the early afternoon to visit a small, desolate lake hidden deep in the hills. It wasn't a place anyone went often. Locals didn't talk about it much. My friends and I had stumbled upon it once before during a hike, and something about the isolation drew us back. The drive was long and winding, and by the time we arrived, the sun was just starting to dip behind the trees. The lake was peaceful, the water shimmering under the fading light. We were the only ones there, and it felt like our own private sanctuary. We unpacked our things, set up our chairs, and cracked open a few beers. The air was still and cool, but something felt off. I couldn't quite put my finger on it. The silence wasn't natural. There was a kind of tension in the air that made the back of my neck prickle. I shrugged it off, assuming I was just imagining things. We spent a few hours lounging by the water, laughing, talking about nothing in particular. The stillness of the lake seemed to stretch endlessly in front of us, but with each passing hour, the quiet felt less like a serene escape and more like something was watching from beyond. It wasn't until the sun had fully set that things began to feel wrong. The faintest whisper of a breeze started stirring the surface of the water, creating ripples that seemed to echo far too loudly in the quiet. The shadows stretched longer, and we started to hear distant noises, something scraping, dragging, far in the woods. My friends didn't seem bothered, but I felt my stomach knot. I tried to dismiss the feeling as nerves from being so isolated, but something in the air felt wrong. Every so often I'd glance toward the tree line, expecting to see someone or something. But there was nothing. Just trees, silent and still. As the last bit of light faded, we all decided it was time to head back. The trip back was uneventful, and we didn't talk much. The tension between us palpable. It wasn't until we were far away from the lake that things got truly strange. That's when my phone buzzed. A text popped up. I'm still there. I froze. My heart began to pound as I looked around the car. No one else had mentioned anything about sending a text. I quickly unlocked my phone to check who it was from. The message wasn't from any of my friends. It was a number I didn't recognize. "I'm still there," it read again. My breath hitched as I realized the sender wasn't just talking about the lake. They were still there. I looked out the window, my eyes scanning the dark fields and forests rushing past. But there was no one. No car following us. No signs of movement. Just the empty, winding road. My phone buzzed once more, and this time the message read, "I've been following you since the lake." I clenched the steering wheel tighter. My mind raced. I wanted to believe it was some kind of prank, but deep down, I knew that wasn't possible. My friends hadn't received any message like that. No one could have known we were at the lake. We pulled over at a small, desolate gas station on the edge of town. The place was eerily quiet, and the flickering neon sign seemed to reflect the same unsettling silence from earlier. I stepped out, trying to shake off the creeping paranoia, but the world outside felt off. As I filled the gas tank, I kept glancing back toward the car, waiting for something. Anything. A noise from behind made me whip around. Nothing. But I could swear someone was watching from the darkened edge of the forest. Their shadows stretched impossibly long under the gas station's weak lights. I hurried back to the car, my phone gripped tightly in my hand. As I slid into the driver's seat, my heart skipped a beat when the screen lit up again. "I'm still here." This time, the message came with a photo, one of the lake. But it wasn't the peaceful image we remembered. The water was dark, and in the distance, barely visible in the fading light, something moved, something tall and unnatural. The last message followed. "I'll be with you, always." I never looked back as I drove. I couldn't. I never believed in strange things happening at home. The old house I grew up in was familiar, full of memories and comforting noises. But that night, everything changed. It was a quiet evening. I was alone, lying in bed with the windows open, listening to the distant hum of the city far away. The house had an odd creak here and there, but nothing unusual. My parents were away for the weekend, and I enjoyed the peace and quiet. Around 2 a.m., I woke to something that didn't fit with the usual night sounds. There was a faint knocking coming from the living room. It wasn't loud or aggressive, just soft, steady knocks, one after the other, slow and deliberate. At first I thought maybe I was imagining things, but the sound was too clear, too precise. I slipped out of bed, heart pounding. The hallway felt colder than it should have, the shadows deeper than usual. As I approached the living room, the knocking stopped. My breath hitched as I glanced around the room. Nothing was out of place. The furniture was as I had left it, and the windows were shut tight. I stood there for a long moment, trying to convince myself it had been nothing. Then I heard it again, this time closer, sharper. Knocks, like someone tapping a finger against glass. I froze, stepping back into the hallway. I thought of waking up a neighbor, but the knocking didn't sound like it was coming from the front door. It was deeper, as if something was knocking from inside the walls. I hurried to the nearest window, peering out. The street was empty, silent. The only sounds were the faint hum of distant traffic and the echo of those knocks, still faint but growing louder. Panic set in. I tried calling my parents, but there was no signal. My phone was useless. I locked the front door and the back door, but the knocking didn't stop. It was as if whatever it was had moved inside the walls. As I stood there, my eyes fixed on the dark hallway, I noticed something strange. The knocking was synchronized with my heartbeat. Faster as mine raced, slower as I calmed. It was as if something was trying to match me, tracking me. Then came the whisper. A voice, barely audible, just beyond hearing. "Let me in." I spun around, but there was nothing. My pulse felt like it was going to explode. The whispers grew louder, almost pleading. The knocking had stopped, replaced by something even more chilling. Footsteps. Light, deliberate steps, echoing in the empty house. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move. The air felt thick, as though something had filled the space around me. I pressed myself against the wall, heart pounding. Finally, the whisper became clearer. "Let me in." The footsteps grew closer, slower, deliberate. I couldn't escape the feeling that whatever was making those sounds was right behind me. My hands trembled as I slowly turned around, expecting to find something, anything. But there was nothing. The house was still, only the faint hum of the fridge and the soft creak of the old floorboards. I don't know how long I stood there, too afraid to move, too terrified to speak. Whatever had been there, whatever was knocking, had vanished. When morning came, I checked every inch of the house. Nothing was out of place. There were no signs of anything unusual. I still don't know what happened that night, but I do know one thing. Whatever it was, it hasn't returned. And I pray it never does. My friends and I decided on a whim to take the long trail that stretched along the edge of the cliffs, far from any roads, towns, or lights. We wanted nothing but peace, a chance to get away from everything. We parked at the base of the trail, unloaded our backpacks, and began the slow ascent. The air was clear, and the sound of crickets filled the silence. It was peaceful. That was the only word for it. Peaceful. At first, we hiked for what felt like hours, the trail winding through thick patches of trees that would occasionally break into clearings with breathtaking views of the valley below. It was beautiful, like stepping into another world. At some point, we decided to stop for a break near the edge of the cliffs. The drop below wasn't something to mess with, but we sat there, taking in the view, enjoying the stillness. That's when things started to feel off. We noticed a faint noise, like someone dragging something heavy. It wasn't loud, but it was persistent. At first, we figured it was just the wind shifting rocks or something. No big deal. But then, the sound grew closer. I got up, walking a few steps toward the edge of the trail, and strained my ears, trying to pinpoint it. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was my imagination. But then, I blinked, and there it was again. A figure. At the edge of the cliff, maybe 50 feet below us, just standing there. No flashlight, no movement, just still, like a shadow cast by the rocks. I could barely make out the details, but something about it felt wrong, unnatural. I called my friends over, but when they looked, there was nothing there. I didn't know what to say. My heart was racing as I tried to convince myself it was just some hiker far off in the distance. We decided to keep walking, thinking maybe we'd imagined it. The trail grew quieter the further we went, and the shadows of the trees seemed to stretch longer with each step. We came to a part of the trail where the ground dropped off steeply again, the cliff face towering above us. As we moved closer to that edge, the air seemed heavier. The noise returned, faint, dragging footsteps, but now accompanied by whispers, distant and soft. I could barely make out the words, but they sent chills down my spine. "We're still here," they said. My friends were laughing, unaware of what I'd heard. I looked around, trying to convince myself I was imagining things, but the unease in my chest was growing. The figure was still out there, watching us. I could feel its presence, even though I couldn't see it. We reached a part of the trail where the trees thinned, giving us a view of the valley again. Below, I saw something that made my stomach drop. Another figure standing by the edge of the cliff far below, and then another, and another, until the entire expanse below was filled with dark shapes that seemed to be watching us, unmoving. I froze. My friends kept walking, oblivious, but I couldn't move. I wanted to scream, to shout, but my voice wouldn't come. The figures, there were dozens of them, seemed to blend into the shadows of the cliffs, but I could feel their eyes on me. I couldn't look away from the sight below, even as panic began to rise in my chest. My legs felt like they were rooted to the ground. They didn't move, didn't make a sound, but I knew they were waiting. I turned around and yelled at my friends to stop, but they couldn't hear me. I could barely hear myself. "Guys, stop!" I shouted, my voice barely more than a whisper. They were already too far ahead, unaware of what I had seen. I begged them to come back, but it was like they didn't even hear me. My mind was screaming, "Run back! Run back!" But my feet wouldn't move. My gaze was still locked on the figures far below. The dragging sound grew louder again, this time coming from above, behind me. I could feel something close, closer than it had been before. I turned around slowly, and that's when I saw it. The figure from earlier, the one by the cliff, now standing just a few feet away from me. Its face wasn't visible, but I could feel it watching me. Its presence seemed to drown out everything else. The sound of my friends, the wind, everything except the slow, deliberate footsteps drawing closer. "We're still here," it whispered again, and I could feel its breath against my neck. I didn't move. I couldn't. The figure leaned in closer, and I swear I could feel its cold, lifeless stare boring into me. But then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it stopped. The dragging noise and whispers faded. The figure stood there for a moment longer, then turned and slowly walked back into the shadows of the cliff. By some miracle, my friends finally heard me screaming, and they ran back to find me. We left that trail as fast as we could, but I can still feel it, like something is out there, waiting, still. It was a quiet evening in my apartment, the kind where the city feels distant despite being just outside the window. The only sounds were the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional distant car passing by. I had just settled in for the night, the blinds drawn and the dim glow of my desk lamp casting long shadows across the room. I wasn't sure how long I had been sitting there when I noticed something strange. It was faint at first, a whispering sound, barely audible, like someone was speaking, but I couldn't make out the words. I tried to dismiss it, telling myself it was just the wind or some noise from the neighbors. But it wasn't just outside the window. It was inside my apartment. I listened closer, holding my breath. The whispering grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't coming from any specific direction, but rather seemed to be coming from everywhere. It felt like the walls were alive, the air itself vibrating with those strange, unintelligible sounds. I got up and moved toward the hallway, my footsteps echoing faintly. The whispers followed, as if they were inside my head. I turned on the hallway light, hoping it would stop whatever was making that sound, but the light did nothing. The whispers continued, now more persistent, almost like they were speaking my name. The sound was almost melodic, but there was something eerie about it, something off. I decided to step into my bedroom and close the door behind me. The moment I did, the whispers stopped. It was quiet again, the kind of silence that made my skin crawl. I stood there, heart pounding, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Maybe I was imagining it. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. But then I heard it again, this time, more clear, coming from just outside the door. "Let me in." The voice wasn't human. It wasn't like any sound I've ever heard before. It was low, hollow, almost mechanical, but filled with an unnatural urgency. I didn't move. I couldn't move. I was frozen in place, my entire body trembling. "Let me in," the voice repeated, louder this time, like it was right outside the door. I could feel the floor beneath me shaking slightly, as if something was pressing against it from the other side. I knew I had to do something. I grabbed my phone, hands shaking as I tried to call the police. The line rang and rang, but no one answered. The phone died, the screen flickering, leaving me in total silence once again. The whispers started again, this time from deeper inside the apartment, coming from the shadows that seemed to stretch across the floor like living things. They didn't make any sense, but they were there, filling the air with a sense of dread that I couldn't escape. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed in my room, with the door locked, listening to those whispers, until the first light of dawn broke through my blinds. When morning finally came, everything was quiet. No signs of anything strange. My apartment looked the same, as if nothing had happened. But the whispers, they haven't stopped. I still hear them sometimes, late at night when the city noise dies down and the silence takes over. I don't know what they are, but I know they're still there, waiting. It started as an ordinary Sunday drive through the countryside. I'd packed a few snacks, some music, and planned to spend the day exploring the old back roads, places I hadn't visited in years. The sun was shining, casting long shadows across the fields as I drove along, lost in the quiet hum of the engine and the occasional chirping of birds. My destination was a small, forgotten town deep in the woods. It wasn't marked on any maps or GPS. It was one of those places that only showed up if you knew where to look. I had vague memories of visiting there as a kid, but everything had changed since then. The road wound tighter into the trees, and as I drove deeper, the world felt as if it was folding in around me. I was eager for the quiet, for a break from the city, but the stillness of the woods began to feel oppressive, almost too quiet. It was as though the trees were watching, the silence pressing down like a weight. Eventually, I reached the old town, or what was left of it. Time had all but erased it. The town was overgrown with vines, the wooden houses leaning in on themselves, abandoned and forgotten. There were no signs of life, no people, no vehicles, just a faint echo of the past. I parked my car near the edge of what was once Main Street and started walking. The ground beneath my feet was uneven, cracked and covered in weeds. The air smelled damp and musty, like something had been left to rot. I passed the old general store, its windows broken and faded posters peeling away. I peeked inside and saw remnants of a life long gone, dusty shelves, faded signs, and the unmistakable scent of decay. Something about it made my skin crawl, but curiosity drove me forward. I wandered through the town, stumbling over old bricks and rusted metal, feeling as though I was stepping through a memory. Every sound seemed amplified in the quiet, my footsteps echoing off the crumbling walls, the creak of dry wood, the distant call of birds. It was peaceful, yet unsettling. As the sun began to set, I reached the outskirts of town. I sat on an old stone bench, trying to take in the view of the overgrown fields and the distant horizon. The quiet seemed to stretch forever, the woods pressing closer with each passing moment. That's when I heard it. A faint sound, barely audible at first. A whisper. It wasn't human, but something inhuman. I froze, my heart pounding. I strained my ears, listening, but the woods remained silent except for the rustling of leaves in the breeze. The whisper grew louder, as if it was circling around me, distant but persistent. I stood, my hands trembling, and turned in a slow circle, searching for the source. The woods were darkening, the last light of day vanishing behind the trees. Then, just beyond the edge of my vision, I saw it. Movement. A shadow, shifting among the trees. My breath caught in my throat. It didn't look human. It was tall, too tall, and its figure twisted unnaturally as if it didn't belong in the world. I wanted to run, but my legs refused to move. The whisper became a soft, eerie chant now, growing louder and more insistent. The figure moved closer, the shadow stretching and twisting as it approached. I could feel its presence, as if it were staring at me with hollow, empty eyes. It wasn't human, not in the way I knew. It was something older, something that had been waiting for a long, long time. Tears blurred my vision as I stumbled backward. My mind raced, trying to find an explanation, but nothing made sense. The figure was no longer a shape, but a dark void, surrounding me in silence and fear. Just when I thought I couldn't bear it anymore, the whisper faded. The figure stood still for a moment, then turned, vanishing into the woods as silently as it had come. I stood there, trembling, as the night fully set in. The woods were silent once again, but I knew I hadn't imagined it. That thing, whatever it was still out there, watching, waiting. I slowly made my way back to my car, heart still racing. As I drove away, I glanced back at the town once more, the memories of the whisper still echoing in my mind. I haven't gone back since. It was late October, the leaves crunching beneath my feet as I made my way down the quiet country road. I had decided to take a long walk that evening, needing some fresh air away from the dull hum of city life. The sun was setting, casting long dark shadows over the rolling hills, and the only sound was the gentle rustling of trees in the breeze. I'd grown up in this area, a small town surrounded by farmland and open spaces. The woods were always eerie at night, but tonight felt different. The air was colder, heavier. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. As I walked, I noticed how distant the usual sounds of animals had become. No crickets, no rustling of leaves, just silence. Even the wind had quieted. I reached the edge of the woods, the trees towering like silent sentinels on either side of the road. The sun had nearly set now, leaving only a dim orange glow on the horizon. It was too early to be this dark. That's when I saw it, standing between two trees, perfectly still, a figure watching me from the shadows. It was human-shaped, but there was something off about it. Its posture was wrong, unnatural. I stopped walking, my breath catching in my throat. I couldn't see its face clearly, but I could feel its gaze locked on me. I stood there, heart pounding, unsure if I should move or run. The figure didn't move, didn't blink. It was like something out of a nightmare, just a shadow in the fading light. My legs felt frozen as I tried to look away, but something held my gaze. Who's there? My voice trembled as I forced the words out. The silence stretched on, and then nothing. No response, no sound of breathing, no movement. I wanted to run. I turned back toward the road, but as I did, I saw another figure appear in the distance, emerging from the opposite side of the woods. This one was even closer than I thought possible. It didn't walk, it glided, silently, effortlessly. My stomach twisted as I realized it wasn't human. The shape was wrong, distorted, like something had stretched it out of proportion. My mind raced as I backed away, hands trembling, my heartbeat echoing in my ears. I didn't stop until I was nearly at the edge of the road. The two figures, now several feet apart, stood motionless, their black, empty eyes staring toward me. I realized, with a sick feeling in my stomach, that I hadn't heard any footsteps, just silence. And yet they were there, both of them, in the middle of nowhere, watching me. I turned and ran, my legs carrying me as fast as they could, the figures vanishing into the darkness behind me. I never looked back. To this day, I don't know what they were, but I know they weren't human. It started on a normal afternoon, a day like any other. I had taken my son to the old park, the one we used to go to when he was younger. The park had always been a peaceful escape from the city, full of tall trees and winding paths that led nowhere in particular. Today, though, something felt off. We had the whole place to ourselves, which wasn't unusual. It was a weekday, and most people didn't visit parks during these hours. I let my son run ahead, chasing after a frisbee he'd thrown. I stood at the edge of a small pond watching him play. The water rippled under the weight of the afternoon sun, and the sound of the birds was soothing. Then, out of nowhere, everything changed. I heard the sound of footsteps behind me, slow and deliberate. I turned, expecting to see another parent or maybe a jogger, but there was no one. Just trees, their branches swaying gently in the wind. Must be my imagination, I muttered to myself. But as I turned back to the pond, the footsteps came again. This time, closer. My son didn't seem to notice, still lost in his game. I told myself I was just on edge. The woods could make noises feel louder than they were, right? but the footsteps weren't fading. They were steady, relentless. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaky. No answer. I tried to convince myself that maybe someone had wandered into the park, someone harmless. Still, my heart pounded in my chest and I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I glanced around, trying to find the source of the sound, but saw no one. The footsteps came again, closer this time, circling around the pond. My son, still unaware, continued chasing the frisbee, laughing as he ran. "Stop playing," I shouted, my voice trembling now. "We're leaving." He didn't hear me. Or maybe he didn't care. I clenched my fists, trying to keep my composure, but my legs felt like they wanted to run. My instincts screamed at me to get out of there, but I couldn't just leave him. Then, as I stepped toward the pond, I saw something. Something in the water. It wasn't a reflection. It was a figure. A shadow, floating just beneath the surface. It wasn't moving like anything natural. It seemed to be watching us. Unmoving. Unmoving. I took a step back from the water, my breath hitching in my throat. What was it? Some kind of trick of the light? My mind raced, but fear took over. I had to get my son. "Come on," I called again, louder this time, my voice breaking. My son didn't seem to hear me. He was too far gone in his play, oblivious to the danger I now felt closing in. I sprinted toward him, my heart screaming with every step. I grabbed his arm, pulling him hard. His laughter stopped, replaced by confusion. "What's wrong, Dad?" "We're leaving." "Now," I said, trying to keep my voice calm but firm. As I turned back toward the path, I saw it again. The figure, this time fully visible. It stood at the edge of the pond, watching us. Not human, not animal. Something else entirely. Its form was blurred, not entirely solid, but its eyes were unmistakable. Dark, hollow, watching us. I held my son tighter, running, my breath ragged. We didn't look back, didn't stop until we were far away from that place. As we reached the park entrance, I glanced once more over my shoulder. The figure was still there, motionless, watching us. The only thing I could hear was the sound of my heartbeat, racing through my ears. We never went back to that park, and I never looked into water the same way again. It was just a normal Sunday afternoon, and I had decided to take a long drive out to the outskirts of town. The weather was crisp and clear, the kind of day that makes you want to get away from the noise of the city. I hadn't been out this way before, but something about the empty roads and open fields had always called to me. I drove down winding country roads, surrounded by endless fields of tall grass. It was so quiet that the only sounds were the hum of the car engine and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. The air smelled fresh, and for once there was no one around. I appreciated the peace, letting my mind wander. As I drove, I noticed an old barn sitting off in the distance. It wasn't much, just a weathered wooden structure surrounded by overgrown weeds, but something about it tugged at me. I couldn't quite explain why, but I felt an inexplicable pull toward it. So I decided to take a detour, leaving the main road behind. When I parked and stepped out of the car, the silence was overwhelming. It wasn't a comforting silence, though. It felt oppressive, as if the very earth was holding its breath. I approached the barn cautiously. The wood creaked beneath my feet as I made my way closer. The door hung open slightly, swinging faintly in the breeze. I hesitated but stepped inside. The interior was dark, lit only by the faint slivers of sunlight that managed to filter through cracks in the old wood. The place smelled like damp hay and decay. My footsteps echoed, the sound amplified in the stillness. The barn wasn't empty. In the far corner, partially hidden by shadows, stood something tall and thin. I wasn't sure what it was. At first I thought it was just old farm equipment or debris. But as I drew closer, I realized it wasn't. It wasn't human, but neither was it entirely unfamiliar. Its form was elongated, with arms that seemed too long, bending unnaturally. Its face, if you could call it that, was hollow and void, no features to speak of, just a black void where the eyes should have been. It stood completely still, like a statue, as if waiting. My heart raced. I wanted to turn and run, but I couldn't move. It felt like the barn had shifted, trapping me in a place with some unseen force. The figure didn't move, didn't react. It simply stood there, watching. And then it spoke. Its voice wasn't human. It wasn't even a voice in the way we think of it. It was more of a whispering thought that seemed to echo inside my own head. "Why are you here?" I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came out. The question hung in the air, unanswered. The barn door creaked louder, and I heard the sound of footsteps behind me. I turned, but there was no one there. The oppressive silence returned, but now there was something else. Something watching. The figure in the corner shifted, just slightly, as if it had taken a step toward me. My legs finally moved, carrying me in a frantic stumble toward the door. As I reached for the handle, I looked back, catching a glimpse of something in the shadows. It wasn't just the figure now. There were more, a dozen, maybe more, standing motionless in the dark corners of the barn, all watching me with those empty voids for eyes. I couldn't escape them. The door wouldn't open. I turned back, heart pounding, my breath coming in sharp gasps. The barn felt like it was closing in, folding around me. Then I saw it, the face of one of them, so close now. It was right in front of me, and still it didn't have eyes, just a featureless black void. And yet, I felt it staring deep into me, past my skin and into my soul. The whisper came again. Louder now. "Why are you here?" This time, I heard my own voice answer, trembling and weak. I don't know, but I did know. I knew something had been waiting for me. It wanted something I couldn't understand. In that moment, I realized that leaving the barn wasn't an option, and neither was forgetting. It was a lazy Sunday afternoon when I decided to go for a drive. I had been feeling restless lately, and the open road seemed like the perfect escape. I grabbed my keys, jumped into my car, and drove aimlessly, taking whatever turns felt right. Eventually, I found myself deep in the countryside, miles from any sign of civilization. The roads twisted and turned, surrounded by nothing but trees and fields. The further I drove, the quieter it became. No cars, no people, just the hum of the engine and the distant chirp of birds. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. After a while, I came across an old farmhouse. Its paint was peeling and the windows were dark and empty. It looked like it hadn't been touched in years. Curiosity got the better of me, so I pulled up beside the house, parking a little ways off the dusty driveway. I sat there for a moment, staring at the abandoned building. There was something unsettling about it, something that didn't sit right. I decided to get out and take a closer look. The wooden porch creaked under my feet as I approached the front door. Dust and cobwebs covered every surface. The house smelled old, like something had been left to rot inside. My breath fogged up the cracked window and I peered inside. It was empty, completely stripped of life. Chairs lay overturned, curtains torn and hanging in tatters. It was as if the house had been waiting for someone to return. As I wandered through the house, a strange feeling settled over me. The air was still, almost too still. It felt as if I wasn't alone. My skin crawled, and I couldn't shake the sensation of being watched. I called out, but no answer came. It was like the world had gone silent, the kind of silence that feels oppressive, as if something is breathing just beyond it. Upstairs, I found a room at the end of a narrow hallway. The door was slightly ajar, creaking when I pushed it open. Inside, the room was filled with faded furniture and more cobwebs. On the wall was a single photograph, worn and faded, its edges curling up. A family stood there, smiling, though their eyes seemed hollow, their grins fake. The photo sent a chill down my spine. Then I heard a sound from below, a faint, distant thud. My heart skipped a beat. I listened, straining to hear. The sound came again, closer this time. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, like someone, or something, was walking through the house. I stood frozen, listening. The footsteps came from downstairs, echoing up the creaking staircase. I should have run. I knew that. But my legs wouldn't move. The fear had paralyzed me. Then I heard it. The sound of something else. A faint, whispering voice. I couldn't make out the words, just the soft murmur as if someone was speaking in another language. It came from below, growing louder, as if whatever it was had found its way into the house. Tears filled my eyes as I forced myself to move. I couldn't explain why, but I felt compelled to go back to the front door. My mind screamed at me to run, but my body wouldn't obey. I moved slowly down the stairs, each creak beneath my feet sounding louder than the last. At the front door, I hesitated, my hand trembling as I reached for the knob. I had never been more afraid in my life. The whispers had grown so loud, they felt like they were in my head. I turned the knob, pushed the door open, and stepped out into the daylight. The house looked different from the outside, somehow darker, more twisted. I expected to see someone standing there watching me, but there was nothing, just the empty fields stretching out before me. The whispering faded, and the silence returned. I drove away without looking back. The house stayed with me, though. The image of that photograph, the whispering voice, it all felt too real. I don't know what I experienced that day, and I don't want to know. Some things are better left unexplained. It was a quiet evening when my friends and I decided to take a drive out to the old orchard at the edge of town. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows over the rolling hills, and the air was crisp. We had heard stories about the orchard, about how it had once been a thriving farm, but now lay abandoned, overgrown with wild grass and tangled vines. None of us really knew what to expect, but something about the place drew us there. Maybe it was the thrill of something forgotten, something lost to time. The old farmhouse at the center of the orchard stood there, half collapsed, its windows shattered and roof caved in. The wooden beams creaked softly in the wind, as if the house itself was moaning. We parked the car at the edge of the orchard and walked deeper into the field. The ground beneath our feet was uneven, covered in fallen apples and weeds. The air smelled earthy, and there was a faint sweetness from the ripened fruit still hanging from the trees. As we approached the farmhouse, the feeling of being watched set in. It wasn't the kind of eerie quiet you'd expect. No birds sang, no rustling of leaves. It was dead quiet. Too quiet. We made our way inside, the wooden floorboards groaning beneath us. The place was a mess. Old furniture scattered, walls splintered, and dust floating through the air like whispers. A sense of unease clung to the room, heavier with each passing second. It wasn't just the silence. It was as if something had been waiting in the shadows for us. One of my friends, Sarah, wandered into the next room. I followed behind, but stopped when I noticed something odd. In the corner of the room, there was a chair. No, 2 chairs. Both were facing each other, but they were old, cracked, as if they hadn't been touched in years. The legs were splintered, and dust coated the seats like a film. What disturbed me most was the way they seemed to be positioned, like they had been placed deliberately, waiting for something or someone. "Why are the chairs like that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know," Sarah replied, frowning. "It's creepy." We both stood there, staring at the chairs, the silence pressing down harder. I had the sudden, irrational thought that someone, or something, might be sitting there, just out of sight. As we explored further, we came across the kitchen. The cabinets were open, broken plates and jars scattered on the floor. It was here that we found the most unsettling thing of all, a photograph. It was crumpled, lying on the countertop. A family of 4 stared back at us. The man and woman smiled weakly, while 2 children sat on either side of them. What caught our attention wasn't the photo itself, but the absence of their faces. The photo had been torn, their features missing as though someone had tried to erase them. All that remained were empty eyes, hollow and void of life. "What happened here?" Sarah whispered. Her voice trembled. "I don't know," I replied, my throat dry. As we turned to leave, I noticed something moving outside the shattered window. A figure, thin, tall, standing in the distance just beyond the trees. I couldn't make out any features, only the silhouette of someone or something watching us from the edge of the orchard. My heart pounded and I stepped back, whispering, "Do you see that?" Sarah followed my gaze, her eyes widening. I saw it too. The figure didn't move, just stood there, watching. Its presence felt ancient, as though it had been waiting for us to arrive. "We need to get out of here," I said, grabbing her hand. As we hurried toward the car, I kept glancing back, half expecting to see something, anything, trailing behind us. But there was nothing. The figure remained distant, still unmoving. Once we reached the car and drove away, I stole one last glance in the rearview mirror. The orchard was behind us, the farmhouse a dark silhouette against the fading light, and still I felt that unseen gaze following us. To this day, I can't explain what we saw or didn't see, but I know one thing for sure. Whatever it was waiting, and it's still out there. It was the kind of day that felt too perfect to be real, the kind of day you only ever see in old photos or travel brochures. My friends and I decided to take a trip out to a secluded beach, tucked away from the usual tourist spots. We'd heard whispers of its beauty from a few locals, but no one really talked about what else might be there. We didn't care. We just wanted the peace and quiet. The drive there was uneventful, winding through winding, narrow roads that twisted through dense forests. The radio played softly, our conversations mellow, as we joked about what kind of adventures awaited us at the shore. It felt like we had the whole world to ourselves. We finally reached the beach in the late afternoon, the sun already low on the horizon. The sand stretched out in front of us, golden and untouched. The sound of the waves crashing on the shore was soothing. For the first time in a long time, we truly felt free. We spent the day swimming, building sandcastles, and exploring the tide pools. It was idyllic. But as the sun dipped further, casting long shadows across the sand, something started to feel off. The beach, once full of laughter and cheer, grew quiet. The air seemed to thicken, the usual comforting sounds of waves and birds fading into silence. It wasn't that we felt unwelcome, just uneasy, like something was watching. As the last light of the day faded, we gathered our things, feeling reluctant to leave the peaceful stretch of shore behind. I was about to suggest we head back when one of my friends, Laura, stopped dead in her tracks. "Wait, do you hear that?" she asked, her voice shaky. We all stopped and strained to listen. At first, it was just the sound of the ocean, but then I realized she wasn't talking about the waves. There was something else, a faint, rhythmic thudding, soft but insistent, like something hitting the ground just beyond the edge of the trees. "What is that?" I whispered, my stomach tightening. We couldn't see anything, just the dark silhouettes of trees looming beyond the beach. The sound grew louder, closer, and now I was sure I could hear another noise. Whispers. Low, unintelligible voices like they were murmuring right at the edge of hearing. "I think we should go," one of my other friends, Mike, said, his voice barely above a whisper. His face was pale, his eyes wide. "Maybe someone's camping out there," Laura suggested, but her words trembled as she spoke. The thudding noise stopped abruptly and the whispers fell silent. A sudden chill swept through the air. It felt like something had just moved, watching us from the darkness. "I think we should go now," I said, my voice firm. The fear in the air was impossible to ignore. We started walking quickly toward the car parked at the edge of the forest. My mind was racing. What could have made that noise? What had those whispers been? As we neared the edge of the woods, something caught my eye. A figure just beyond the tree line. It wasn't moving, just standing there, watching us. It was dark, featureless, but I could feel its gaze boring into me. I stopped, unable to look away. "Come on," Mike yelled from a few steps ahead. I blinked, shaking my head. The figure was gone. We piled into the car, driving quickly away from the beach. The silence inside was deafening, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. None of us spoke, each lost in our own thoughts. That feeling, the sensation of being watched, hadn't left any of us. It wasn't until we were back in town that Laura spoke up again, her voice breaking the silence. "I've never told anyone this, but when I was walking down the beach earlier, I saw something in the water," she said quietly. A face, floating beneath the surface. It wasn't human. We all fell silent. None of us had seen the face she mentioned, but somehow I wasn't surprised. What we heard, what we saw, whatever it was still there, watching from the shadows of the trees. To this day, I haven't returned to that beach. And I never will.
But the wind didn't make whispers like that soft, almost melodic, as if they were calling to me. When we reached the bottom of the trail, I was relieved to be back on solid ground. But as we were walking back to our car, something stopped me. I glanced back toward the lighthouse, and for a moment, I thought I saw movement. At the top of the stairs, just for a split second, I saw a figure, a silhouette. It wasn't solid, more like a shadow against the fading light. It seemed to be watching us, standing perfectly still. My stomach twisted, and I called out to my friends, but they were already too far ahead. By the time they turned back, there was nothing there. I didn't sleep that night. Even now, weeks later, I still hear the whispers, sometimes faint and distant, like they're always just beyond my reach. The lighthouse may be gone, but whatever it is that watched us from the top, it's still out there. The stairs spiraled up the side of the cliff, worn and partially collapsed, but we made it to the top without much difficulty. The view was breathtaking, the vast expanse of ocean stretching out endlessly beneath us. We felt like we were on top of the world. As we explored the interior of the lighthouse, I noticed something strange. It wasn't just the cracked and broken furniture or the dust-covered rooms. There was an overwhelming sense of stillness. The air felt thick, and it seemed like the walls were watching us. It was then that we heard it, a faint, echoing sound, as though someone was whispering from far away. I stood still, straining my ears, trying to make sense of the noise. My friends didn't seem to notice, too busy taking pictures of the breathtaking view. "Did you hear that?" I asked, but no one seemed to respond. They brushed it off, assuming I was imagining things. But the sound wasn't just in my head, it was real, persistent, and getting louder. As we made our way back down, the whispers continued, growing louder, more distinct. I tried to keep calm, convinced that it was just the wind playing tricks on me, but the wind didn't make whispers like that, soft, almost melodic, as if they were calling to me. When we reached the bottom of the trail, I was relieved to be back on solid ground. But as we were walking back to our car, something stopped me. I glanced back toward the lighthouse, and for a moment, I thought I saw movement. At the top of the stairs, just for a split second, I saw a figure, a silhouette. It wasn't solid, more like a shadow against the fading light. It seemed to be watching us, standing perfectly still. My stomach twisted, and I called out to my friends, but they were already too far ahead. By the time they turned back, there was nothing there. I didn't sleep that night. Even now, weeks later, I still hear the whispers, sometimes faint and distant, like they're always just beyond my reach. The lighthouse may be gone, but whatever it is that watched us from the top, it's still out there. The sun was just beginning to dip below the horizon as I walked down the old, gravel path that led to my grandparents' farm. I loved the place, the wide, open fields, the way the wind whispered through the tall grass. But tonight, there was something different about it. The air felt heavy, and the usual chorus of crickets and birds was eerily silent. I was here to help Grandma prepare for the harvest festival. She had always said that there was a special kind of magic in the soil, and she swore that the night before the festival was when it was strongest. I chuckled at that, but I loved the traditions and stories that surrounded the farm, so I kept an open mind. The old barn loomed ahead, its wood weathered and cracked. The last rays of sunlight caught on its flaking paint, casting long, dark shadows. I pushed open the heavy door, and the smell of dry hay and aged wood filled my nose. I made my way to the back, where Grandma was pulling old lanterns from a shelf. "Come to help, darling," she called out, her voice warm and welcoming. I nodded, and she handed me a lantern with a smile. "This is for you. The light will guide you. But be careful when the dark comes. It can be tricky." I was about to laugh when the barn door creaked open behind me, and a chill ran down my spine. I turned to see a figure standing just outside, silhouetted by the fading light. It was tall, too tall, with long arms that seemed to stretch and bend unnaturally. I blinked, and it was gone. "Did you see that?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. Grandma's expression shifted. She stood up slowly, eyes narrowing. "You're not supposed to see them, but if they want you to, then it's too late." "What do you mean?" I asked, but she didn't answer. Instead, she grabbed my arm and led me out of the barn, her grip surprisingly strong for her age. The sky had darkened, and the first star shone bright, almost like an omen. "It's time for the old stories," Grandma said, her voice low. "The things that come out tonight are older than the land. They want to play. They want to know if you're brave enough to face them." I laughed nervously, but the sound was swallowed by the heavy silence. As we stood in the open field, the wind picked up, carrying with it a low hum that felt almost like a distant, mournful song. Then I heard the soft padding of feet, like someone walking in the tall grass. It was rhythmic, deliberate, and closer than it should have been. I gripped the lantern tighter, the flame flickering wildly as I searched the dark. "Grandma, what's out there?" My voice cracked with fear. "They're just shadows," she said, almost as if she were trying to convince herself. "But they don't like it when you shine light on them." Before I could ask what she meant, a form emerged from the darkness, human in shape, but its limbs bent at odd angles, its face obscured by a veil of black that moved like a living curtain. My blood ran cold, and I took a step back, the lantern nearly slipping from my fingers. "Do you see me?" The figure whispered, its voice like the rustle of dry leaves. It raised an arm, one that stretched and bent until it touched the ground, and then it tilted its head. 1,000 eyes seemed to open in its shadowy veil, blinking and staring, each one colder than the last. I couldn't move. My heart thudded so hard I thought it would burst. Grandma reached out and put her hand on my arm. Her touch was the only warmth I felt as the figure took a step closer. "Look away," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Don't let them in." But it was too late. I looked, and for a second, I saw my own reflection in one of those cold, blinking eyes. And then, the figure stepped back, vanishing into the dark as if it had never been there. The silence returned, but it was not the same. It was heavy, alive, and watching. Grandma squeezed my arm and nodded solemnly. "They will remember you now. Be careful. The dark always comes back for those who have seen it." I didn't sleep that night. And every night since then, I hear that faint, shuffling step in the distance, the same as before, and the whisper, "Do you see me?" I know now that I can never truly escape it, not when the dark is always waiting, just beyond the reach of my lantern's light. I could feel the presence of something intangible, like it was breathing down my neck. Sam grabbed my arm again, this time with desperate force. We sprinted, zigzagging through the garden until we finally burst through the main entrance, gasping for air. The night outside felt different, safer, as if we'd left the garden's grip behind. We didn't stop until we were back at my car, the engine roaring to life as I sped away, the garden shrinking in the rearview mirror. But it wasn't until I got home and checked the back seat that I found it a small, wrinkled flower. One I had never seen before, sitting on the seat like an unholy offering. The voice echoed in my ears, an echo that would stay with me forever. Not so fast. The sun had just slipped below the horizon, leaving us in a twilight that made everything appear more vivid. It was there, in the middle of a patch of wild flowers, that I noticed something strange. The flowers were moving. I blinked, thinking it was just the wind, but the motion was rhythmic, like breathing. "Did you see that?" Sam asked, squinting at the patch. I nodded, but before I could say anything, there was a shuffling sound behind us, something small moving through the grass. We turned quickly, eyes searching the darkening garden, but it was empty. I laughed nervously, probably a raccoon or something, but Sam didn't look convinced. His eyes were fixed on the path we just walked down. A sudden chill ran down my spine, but I brushed it off as the cool of the evening. We decided to head back, but as we retraced our steps, I noticed that the garden was eerily quiet. The usual chirp of crickets and the occasional hoot of an owl were gone. I stopped walking, listening hard. The silence was thick, suffocating. Then came the sound of footsteps, heavy, slow steps coming from the direction we had just left. They weren't the light, scuttling steps of an animal, but the deliberate thud of boots against the stone path. My blood ran cold as I glanced at Sam. His face was pale, eyes wide. "Let's go," he whispered, grabbing my arm. We started to run, but the footsteps quickened, matching our pace. It was as if someone, or something, was shadowing us, step for step. The garden paths twisted and turned, dark shapes looming over us as we tried to find the exit. We reached a clearing and stopped to catch our breath. That's when I heard a low voice, raspy and wet, whispering from the shadows, "Not so fast." My heart raced as I spun around, searching for the source. There was no one there, but the whisper had come from just behind a massive oak tree. I could feel the presence of something intangible, like it was breathing down my neck. Sam grabbed my arm again, this time with desperate force. We sprinted, zigzagging through the garden until we finally burst through the main entrance, gasping for air. The night outside felt different, safer, as if we'd left the garden's grip behind. We didn't stop until we were back at my car, the engine roaring to life as I sped away, the garden shrinking in the rearview mirror. But it wasn't until I got home and checked the back seat that I found it a small, wrinkled flower. One I had never seen before, sitting on the seat like an unholy offering. The voice echoed in my ears, an echo that would stay with me forever. Not so fast. I was on my way to visit an old friend who lived on a small farm at the edge of town. The directions he gave were simple enough, and the scenery was beautiful, the hills rolling and dotted with wild flowers. But as the sky deepened to a dusky purple, a strange feeling crept up my spine. The road twisted and turned, narrow enough that my car brushed the bushes on either side. The trees grew thicker, their branches weaving together like a canopy, blocking out most of the light. I knew I was close, just a few more bends, when something caught my eye. A figure stood at the side of the road, half hidden in shadow. I slammed on the brakes, tires screeching, and my heart leapt into my throat. The figure didn't move. I squinted, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It was a man, but his body was bent at an unnatural angle, as if he were being held up by invisible strings. His arms hung limp, fingers brushing against the dirt. His head turned slowly, jerking around as if on a swivel, and his eyes met mine through the glass. The look in them was not human, black and wet, with a depth that seemed to reach inside me and pull. I couldn't breathe before I could scream or drive away. He raised one arm and pointed directly at my car. I didn't wait to see what happened next. I hit the gas, speeding around the curve and desperately trying to tell myself it was just a hallucination or some poor, lost soul. My phone buzzed in the cup holder, but I ignored it. I needed to get to safety, to the farm, to my friend. I glanced at the rearview mirror, and for a split second, I thought I saw him there, just behind the car, staring with those black, soulless eyes. I blinked, and he was gone. When I finally pulled into the gravel driveway of the farm, I slammed the car door and ran up to the porch. The house was quiet, dark with no light spilling through the windows. I knocked, my knuckles hitting the wood like a drumbeat. No answer. Panic clawed at my chest, and I knocked harder, shouting his name. The silence was broken by the sound of footsteps behind me. I spun around, eyes wide, searching the dark yard. The air was damp and cold, and I could see my breath curling in the faint moonlight. Out of the corner of my eye, I caught a movement of figures stepping out from behind the barn. It wasn't my friend. It was him, the man from the road, his body still bent at that unnatural angle. He stepped forward, and as he moved, his limbs made wet, snapping sounds. The same dark, black eyes stared at me. Before I could run, he raised his arm again and pointed a gnarled finger toward the house. The light in the window flickered and blinked out, leaving only darkness. The air seemed to shift, heavy and suffocating, and the yard was filled with a sound I can only describe as whispering hundreds of voices, too quiet to make sense of. But the tone was unmistakable. I turned and bolted for the door, twisting the handle until it nearly broke. Inside, the house was still dark, cold, as if no one had lived there for years. I swept my phone across the room, and its light illuminated something that made my blood freeze. On the wall, written in what looked like smeared ash, were the words, "He's waiting for you." It was supposed to be a simple day trip. My brother and I decided to spend the day exploring the old, abandoned amusement park on the outskirts of town. We'd heard rumors about it being haunted, but that was just the stuff kids said to scare each other. To us, it was a chance to be reckless, to let loose, to do something different. The air was damp with the scent of rain and rust as we pushed open the broken iron gate. The first thing that hit me was the silence. Not the quiet you'd expect in a place like this, but a deep, suffocating silence that felt almost alive. The park was covered in ivy, the rides towering over us like skeletal remains. I glanced at my brother, and he gave a crooked smile, eyes full of mischief. We started with the Ferris wheel. It was massive, its cabins rested and swaying slightly in the breeze, creaking in a way that made my skin crawl. We climbed up to the top, where the view stretched for miles, and for a moment, I felt invincible, but then I heard it, a faint, rhythmic thumping. I glanced down to see if my brother was moving, but he was still staring at the view. The sound came from below us, deep and guttural, almost like someone pounding on the metal support beams. I stiffened, but before I could say anything, it stopped as suddenly as it started. I told myself it was just the wind, but a part of me wasn't convinced. We moved on to the bumper cars next, their faded paint and cracked plastic faces making them look more like grotesque masks than anything fun. I reached out to touch one, and a sharp noise rang out from the darkness, like a metallic screech that made my teeth chatter. My brother froze, his eyes wide. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. Before I could respond, a cold breeze swept through the pavilion, carrying with it a metallic scent that made me gag. The hairs on my neck stood on end. I spun around, trying to find the source, but the pavilion was empty. Just old, rusted cars that looked like they had been left mid-battle. We were about to leave when I noticed something strange in the ticket booth. A shadow moved inside, and I couldn't tell if it was my imagination. I was just about to call out to my brother when a man stepped out. He was hunched over, his clothes tattered and stained. His eyes were wide, black holes that seemed to pierce through me. He opened his mouth, and a dry, rasping voice whispered, "Don't go to the lake." The air went still, and the silence that followed was deafening. My brother's face turned pale, and I grabbed his arm. The man stepped back into the ticket booth, disappearing as if he'd never been there at all. We didn't speak as we ran to the edge of the park, the sound of our footsteps thundering on the cracked pavement. I glanced back once, and in that brief moment, I saw movement, a dozen figures standing at the edge of the trees, watching us with eyes that glowed like embers. We didn't stop running until we reached the road, breathless and shaking. The park looked the same as when we first entered, but the air felt different now, heavier and colder. The next day, I learned that years before, a family had vanished at the lake that bordered the park. No bodies were ever found. Some said they were taken. Others whispered that the lake itself had a hunger for those who dared to come too close. I don't go near the park anymore, but sometimes at night, I can still hear that thumping, that same rhythmic pounding, like someone is trying to claw their way out. And I know, deep down, that whatever is there has seen me, and it's waiting for me to come back. It was the last day of summer, and I decided to take a bike ride out to the old bridge. It was a spot I'd been to countless times before, but something felt different that day. The sun was setting, casting a blood orange glow over the horizon, and the forest surrounding the path whispered in the warm breeze. I'd been riding for nearly an hour when I noticed the silence. The birds had stopped singing, and the crunch of gravel under my tires was the only sound. I slowed down, glancing around nervously. The woods felt alive, but not in a comforting way. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me. When I reached the bridge, I stopped to rest, propping my bike against the guardrail. Below, the river churned, swollen from weeks of rain. I leaned on the edge, staring down into the dark water, when I heard a faint splashing, as though someone, or something, was moving just below the surface. I squinted, trying to see. The sun was almost gone now, painting everything in shades of purple and indigo. I blinked, and then I saw it to pale, bony hands breaking the water, fingers clawing at the air. I stumbled back, nearly falling over my bike. A chilling, guttural moan rose up from the river, sending a cold wave down my spine. Before I could react, a figure burst out of the water, dragging itself up onto the bridge. Its skin was slick and glistening, half covered in river moss. Its eyes were wide and glassy, locked on mine with a stare that made my blood freeze. It moved with a lurching gait, limbs bending in impossible ways as it crawled forward. I couldn't move. My legs felt like they were made of lead. The creature reached out, its fingers twitching, and for a moment I thought it would grab me. But then, a sudden roar echoed through the woods, deep and primal. The creature paused, its head tilting to one side as if it could hear something I couldn't. It let out a sharp, piercing screech, then turned and sprinted back toward the forest, vanishing into the trees with a speed that seemed to defy logic. I stumbled backward, scrambling to my feet and grabbing my bike. Adrenaline surged through me, pushing me forward as I pedaled down the path. The forest was alive with rustling and snapping branches, as if a whole army of things were moving behind me. I didn't dare look back. The ride back was a blur, the world around me reduced to the thumping of my heart and the rhythmic screech of crickets. I finally made it home, slamming the door behind me, locking it as if it would somehow protect me from whatever had emerged from the river. I didn't sleep that night. I kept hearing the sound of water splashing, the shrill scream echoing in my mind. It wasn't until the next morning, when I opened my front door, that I understood the horror of it all. On my porch was a trail of wet, muddy footprints leading from the edge of the woods, where the bridge was, to my doorstep. And in the center of the prints was a small, pale handprint, smeared and barely visible, as if someone had tried to reach out but hadn't quite made it. The woods were still and silent again. But I knew, deep down, that whatever had been in the river hadn't left, and it was still watching. The summer I turned 18, my cousins and I decided to spend the weekend at their grandparents' old farm. The house was on the edge of a small, sleepy town, surrounded by fields that stretched for miles and a patch of forest on one side. I had spent summers there when I was younger, but this time felt different. The place was darker. Somehow, even in the middle of the day, we arrived around mid-afternoon. The farm had a rusted, creaky metal gate that looked like it might fall apart if you touched it, and the paint on the house was chipped and faded. It had been a while since anyone had taken care of it. After we settled in, we explored the property, climbing trees, poking around the old barn, and chasing each other through the long grass. The scent of hay and earth clung to the air, sweet and sharp. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the sky deepened into a rich, bruised blue. That was when we noticed the sound. It started as a low rumble from the woods behind the house, like the growl of distant thunder. But it wasn't quite right. It had a steady, pulsing rhythm to it, almost like footsteps. We looked at each other, nervous laughter escaping us as we tried to dismiss it. Probably just some wild animal, my cousin Peter said, though his voice wavered. But the noise grew louder, and we started hearing whispers, thin and rustling, coming from the woods. It was then that I realized there was a pattern to the noise, like someone was walking through the underbrush, trying to stay hidden but failing. We huddled together, trying to make sense of it. I was about to suggest we go back inside when the air turned colder, and a shadow fell across the yard. A figure stepped out of the forest. It was thin and bent, its limbs moving in jerky motions, like a marionette with tangled strings. I couldn't breathe. The figure took a step forward, and its face came into view. It was pale, almost translucent, with eyes that were dark pits, as if they had been carved out. A low, rasping breath escaped its mouth, and it tilted its head, like it was studying us. Double quotes run. I whispered. We bolted for the house, hearts pounding in our chests. I could hear the figure shuffling behind us, the leaves crunching underfoot. We slammed the door shut, the lock clicking into place just as the figure reached it. For a moment, there was silence. Then came a sharp, scraping sound, like nails dragging down the door. We huddled in the dark, staring at the thin sliver of light under the door. The whispers came again, this time louder, more insistent. I felt a rush of cold air move across my skin, as though something was just inches away. The sound of scraping shifted to a loud thump. And then it stopped. We dared to breathe again, the fear making us dizzy. I reached for my phone, but there was no signal. My cousins whispered about calling for help, but the landline in the kitchen was dead, the cord frayed and hanging limply. Suddenly, a soft knock came from the back door. Peter glanced at me, eyes wide, and whispered, "It's inside." We moved as a group to the kitchen, every step echoing in the silent house. I peeked through the cracked door, and the sight made my blood freeze. The figure was standing on the porch, staring at us through the glass. It didn't move, didn't blink. But then, its mouth opened wider, impossibly wide, and it spoke in a voice like wind through dead branches. "You shouldn't have come back." We backed away, the noise of the night outside pressing in around us. The whispers returned, but this time, they were joined by a second voice, then a third. Shapes began to form in the windows, figures pressing their faces against the glass, eyes black and hollow. The next thing I remember is waking up in the middle of the yard at dawn, the others scattered around me. The house was silent, its doors and windows closed, as if nothing had happened. We checked every room, but there was no sign of the figures, no sound at all. But when I went to the window and looked out at the woods, I saw it again, standing at the edge of the trees, waiting. And I knew that, whatever had been there, it hadn't left. I was always the adventurous one. My friends would hesitate to try something new, but I couldn't resist. That's how I found myself at the edge of the old, abandoned amusement park on the outskirts of town. A place where kids once screamed in delight on the roller coasters, and the smell of popcorn mingled with the scent of cotton candy. Now it was nothing more than a resting skeleton of forgotten joy. It was late in the evening, just past twilight. The air was crisp and smelled of the city, mixed with something older and damp. My friends were hesitant, but agreed to follow me inside. We stepped through a gap in the fence, the iron links jagged and twisted. It wasn't as creepy as I'd expected, at least at first. The Ferris wheel loomed in the distance, its painted wood faded and peeling, but the gentle creak it made as it swayed in the breeze seemed almost alive. We wandered from ride to ride, each one more decayed than the last. The bumper cars sat in their little enclosure, rusted, unmoving, their paint chipped and the windows cracked. We joked about the rides coming to life and scaring us, but the laughter was hollow, even to my ears. It was then we heard the first sound that made me stop in my tracks. A high-pitched giggle, faint, drifting from behind the funhouse. It was a sound I hadn't heard in years, not since childhood, when the park was still alive with laughter and lights. I felt a chill run down my spine, and I turned to my friends. They looked just as uneasy. "I think we should go," one of them said, but I brushed it off. "It's probably just the wind," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. We moved towards the sound, my flashlight casting long, wavering shadows that seemed to dance with us. The giggle came again, louder, and I swore I saw something move behind the funhouse mirrors. I stepped forward, the creaking wood beneath my feet sending a jolt of nerves through me. The door to the funhouse was slightly ajar, hanging on rusted hinges. As I pushed it open, the air inside was colder, sharp and biting. The mirrors on the walls reflected our faces back at us, fragmented and twisted, making us look distorted and monstrous. But there was something else in the mirrors, something moving just out of sight. The way it moved felt wrong, jerky, sudden, as though its limbs didn't bend the right way. "Did you see that?" I whispered. The others nodded, wide-eyed, but no one spoke. We pressed on, each step louder than the last, our breath shaky and uneven. The giggling grew, a child's laughter that seemed to echo in 1,000 directions. A sudden crash behind us made us jump. I spun around, flashlight trembling, and the beam swept across the mirror at the end of the hall. For a moment, I saw it small, with dark, wild hair and eyes too big for its face. It wasn't a reflection. It was real, and it was watching us. We bolted, running past the cracked mirrors and warped carnival games. The laughter followed, sharp and manic. It didn't fade as we reached the entrance. It grew louder, as if we were being herded into a trap. We leapt over the fence and didn't stop running until we were back at the main road, panting, hearts racing. When we looked back, the amusement park stood as silent as before. No laughter, no shadows moving. The night felt suddenly to quiet, like it was holding its breath. I turned to my friends, trying to catch my own breath. "It was just a trick," I said, but the look on their faces told me they didn't believe that. None of us did. That was years ago. I don't go near the park anymore, but sometimes, when I'm alone, I hear that giggle. It's faint at first, just a whisper in the dark, then louder, like it's in the next room, behind the wall, as if it's always been there, waiting. And sometimes, I catch a glimpse of something in the mirror, something small and watching, with eyes too big for its face. It was an ordinary evening when I decided to visit the old amusement park on the outskirts of town. I'd heard rumors that it had been closed for years, that strange things happened there, but I was bored and curious. The park looked harmless enough from the outside, a relic of happier days with its rusting rides and cracked pavement. I walked through the entrance gate, which hung at a crooked angle and creaked as I pushed it open. As soon as I stepped inside, the silence swallowed me. No chirping crickets, no sound of the breeze, just a dead, suffocating quiet that settled like a weight on my chest. I glanced around nervously, half expecting someone to step out from behind one of the weathered booths or from the broken-down carousel. But nothing moved. I wandered down the main path, passing by the Ferris wheel, which loomed above like an iron giant. The paint on the seats had peeled away, leaving them a mottled gray, and they swayed slightly, as if moved by an invisible hand. I shivered, but kept walking. The first odd thing happened when I approached the bumper car arena. A dull, metallic thud resonated behind me, and I spun around to find nothing but shadows. I told myself it was the wind, that I was being paranoid, but the sound had been too distinct to ignore. A sense of dread started to creep in, but I pressed forward. I couldn't be afraid of an empty amusement park, could I? I reached the fun house and stood at the entrance for a moment, debating whether or not I should go in. The wind picked up again, sending a cold draft down the corridor of warped mirrors. The laughter of children echoed from inside, but it sounded wrong, off-key, like a warped recording. I should have turned back, but my feet were moving before I could stop them. Inside, the air was stifling, and the floors creaked beneath my weight. The funhouse had been neglected for years, its walls covered in grime, the once colorful lights dim and flickering. I couldn't tell if it was my imagination, but I could have sworn I saw a shadow flit past in the corner of the room. A sudden crash behind me made me spin around, heart racing. I caught a glimpse of something small and fast darting out of sight. My pulse quickened as I ran, not caring about the twists and turns or the strange, laughing echoes that followed me. I needed to get out, to be away from whatever had just been in there. I stumbled out into the open, gasping for air. The cool night greeted me, but there was no relief. The silence that had swallowed the park was now punctuated by an unsettling giggle. I turned to see the carousel, the horses once bright with paint now dull and covered in moss. but one of them moved. Its head twisted to look at me, eyes wide and hollow, the once friendly smile replaced with something that looked like a snarl. I screamed, backing away as the laughter grew louder, joined by more, until it was a chorus of whispers and high-pitched giggles that surrounded me. My eyes locked onto the entrance I had come through. I bolted, my heart thundering as I passed the crooked gate, the laughter fading behind me like a cruel echo. I ran until I could no longer hear the noise, until the normal sounds of the town returned to me. But even now, when I close my eyes, I can still hear that laugh, the one that came from the twisted carousel horse that watched me as I fled. I had never been a fan of large gatherings, but when my cousin invited me to her annual summer party at the family vineyard, I couldn't say no. The sprawling estate sat atop a rolling hill, its vineyards glistening under the late afternoon sun. The air smelled of sweet grapes and dry earth, and the distant hum of cicadas added a layer of calm to the scene. The party was in full swing when I arrived. Laughter echoed from the patio where friends and family mingled, glasses clinking as they toasted. I made my way through the crowd, exchanging greetings and grabbing a glass of chilled white wine. As the sun began to set, golden light spilled across the rows of grapevines, casting long, twisting shadows that seemed to reach for me. I wandered away from the main gathering, wanting a moment of solitude. The vineyard was beautiful at dusk, the sky streaked with hues of pink and purple. But as I walked deeper into the maze of vines, the air turned cooler, the buzz of the party fading behind me. I turned a corner and found myself at the edge of a small clearing. In the center was an old, rusted metal bench with ivy growing through its slats. I sat down, taking a deep breath as I watched the sky darken. It was then that I noticed a soft, rhythmic thudding sound coming from somewhere nearby. I stood up and looked around, trying to place the noise. It wasn't the wind, it was something much more deliberate. The thumping came again, louder now, from the direction of the old barn at the edge of the vineyard. My curiosity got the better of me, and I started toward it, the crunch of gravel beneath my feet the only sound as I walked. The barn was huge, with weathered wooden doors and broken shutters. I pushed one door open, just enough to peek inside. The dim light revealed dusty barrels, empty crates, and old farming tools. But it was what I heard next that made my blood run cold. A soft, wheezing laugh coming from deep within the shadows. "Hello." My voice trembled as I stepped further in. The laughter stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. The air grew heavier, like it was pressing down on my chest. Suddenly, the barn door slammed shut behind me. I spun around, heart racing, as the latch clicked into place. I pounded on the wood, shouting for someone to help me. No answer. I reached into my pocket for my phone, only to find it dead, the screen dark and unresponsive. I turned back to the barn's interior, searching for a way out. That's when I saw it, a figure standing at the far end, half hidden in shadow. It was tall, too tall, with limbs that seemed to bend in unnatural angles. Its head tilted to the side, and I caught a glimpse of its face pale, hollow-eyed, with a grin that stretched impossibly wide. Before I could scream, it moved. The sound of its uneven footsteps sent a jolt of terror through me as I backed away. The barn was suddenly filled with that same wheezing laugh, a sound so jarring I felt it reverberate through my bones. I grabbed a nearby pitchfork and held it out in front of me, the metal cold and trembling in my grip. I charged at the figure, swinging with all the strength I had. The pitchfork sliced through the air and met nothing but thin, cold mist. The figure dissolved before my eyes, leaving only the stench of rotting grapes and the sound of the party outside. The barn door creaked open, and I stumbled out into the night air, gasping. The vineyard was quiet again, as if nothing had happened. But when I looked back at the barn, the window was dark, and I could swear I saw a pair of hollow eyes watching me from inside. I never spoke of it to anyone, but every year, when the summer party rolls around, I can't help but remember the night I heard that laugh and felt the icy touch of something that wasn't supposed to be there. The first time I saw the lights, I thought it was just my imagination. My friends and I were out on a camping trip, deep in a forest that stretched for miles in every direction. We'd set up our tents near an old, dry creek bed, surrounded by towering trees and the sound of rustling leaves. It was supposed to be a weekend of nothing but stargazing and good company. But that first night, as the fire crackled and we laughed at silly stories, I noticed the lights dot at first. They were small flickers, like fireflies, darting between the trees in the distance. I pointed them out to my friends, but they shrugged it off as some trick of the light. I wasn't convinced. The lights moved too erratically, too deliberately. I could feel my pulse quicken as I watched them dance in the dark, weaving between the trunks like something searching for prey. By the second night, the lights had grown brighter, more constant. They were no longer tiny sparks, they were glowing orbs, weaving and twisting in a pattern I couldn't decipher. They came closer now, stopping just at the edge of the clearing. I wanted to tell my friends, but when I glanced at them, their faces were pale, eyes wide as they looked past me. I turned back, heart thudding in my chest, and found myself staring at a figure just beyond the fire's glow. It was hard to make out in the shifting darkness, but it was tall, almost unnaturally so, with limbs that seemed to stretch too far. Its head was tilted at an impossible angle, and two eyes as bright as the orbs looked directly at me. They were the only thing visible on its dark form, twin headlights piercing the night. A sickening silence fell over the group. The crackle of the fire was the only sound, louder than ever in the void that seemed to have swallowed everything else. My friend, Jonah, reached for his flashlight, but before he could switch it on, the figure moved, fast and fluid, disappearing into the woods. I wanted to call out, to ask what we should do, but my voice was caught in my throat. The lights followed the figure, blinking and weaving through the trees as if they were alive, guiding it deeper into the forest. We didn't speak, couldn't. The realization that whatever we had seen was not human had settled in our bones, cold and terrifying. We packed up the tents and backpacks without a word, barely glancing at each other as we stumbled toward the path out. The night air felt different now, heavy with a static charge that made my skin prickle. The lights were still there, moving behind us, their glow growing more intense, as if they were gaining on us. The forest felt like a maze, a living, breathing thing with walls that shifted as we ran. I glanced back one last time, and in that moment, I understood what the lights were. They weren't guiding the figure. They were it. It had no form without them, no shape without the glow that surrounded it. The lights didn't just move, they hunted. We made it to the edge of the forest just before dawn, stumbling out onto the gravel road. The lights blinked and flared behind us, but they didn't come out of the woods. They paused, their glow fading slowly, like the last breath of a dying star. Then they were gone. It wasn't until later, when we recounted the night to others, that we learned the truth. The locals spoke in hushed voices about the lights of the forest. They called them the wanderers, an ancient presence that moved with the dark, searching for those who dared to stay past the sun. The experience changed us, but that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the nightmares that came after. Dreams of those eyes, that terrible, impossible figure that had no face and no voice, only the light that came and went, always searching. And I realized the last thing I saw before I left that forest wasn't the lights. It was a single, dark shape standing at the edge, watching, waiting for the next night. The night started out like any other. I was out with my sister on a late-night walk along the riverbank, the kind that's more about talking and unwinding than anything else. It was fall, and the leaves were like fire on the trees, glowing under the dim moonlight. We had been talking about everything and nothing, our laughter echoing against the water. We walked a good distance from the street lights, far enough to be swallowed by the gentle darkness. The city was just a smudge in the distance, a heartbeat I could barely hear. The river murmured alongside us, its surface shimmering with the moon's pale gaze. I was just about to ask her what she wanted for her birthday when I heard it. A sound. It was faint, but distinct, a splashing noise. I paused, my gaze darting to the water. "Did you hear that?" I asked. She looked at me with wide eyes, then shook her head. I could feel the cool night air pressing against my skin, making me shiver. It was almost like the river was alive, a giant creature whispering something I couldn't understand. I didn't want to look away, but I did, turning my head back to her and forcing a smile. "Probably just a fish," I said, but my voice was more unsure than I'd intended. Then we heard it again, this time louder and closer. It was a splashing, but not just one. It was a series of splashes, rhythmic, deliberate. I spun around, heart racing. The surface of the water rippled, churning as if something unseen was moving underneath. Before I could speak, a figure shot out of the water, draped in wet, tangled hair and clothes that clung to its skeletal frame. Its eyes were empty, black as the deepest night. It reached out, clawed fingers outstretched, and its mouth fell open in a silent scream. I grabbed my sister's arm, pulling her backward as the creature lunged. It hit the bank with a sickening thud and clawed itself toward us, dragging its body with an unnatural, jerky motion. We stumbled and ran, gasping for breath as we tore through the trees, their branches snagging at our clothes. My sister tripped and fell, and I turned around, my chest already burning from the effort. It was right there, only a few feet away. Its wet eyes locked onto mine, and I couldn't move, couldn't scream. But then, just as suddenly as it had emerged, it froze, its head tilting as if listening to something I couldn't hear. A whistle. Low and guttural, like something shifting in the dark. It was coming from the woods. The creature's mouth shut, and for a second, I thought it was about to retreat. Then it turned its head to the source of the sound, its movements quick and sharp. The dark woods behind us seemed to shiver as something else emerged. Another figure, its shape indistinguishable but bigger, moving with a rhythm that didn't belong to anything human. My sister pulled on my arm, her eyes wide with terror. "We have to go now," she shouted, and I stumbled, barely catching myself before we ran, the sound of wet footsteps pounding after us. We didn't stop until we reached the safety of the nearest street light, our breath ragged, our legs shaking. The creature didn't follow. It stayed there, at the edge of the woods, staring, the inky darkness of its eyes glistening under the moon. I glanced back once more before we sprinted home, every step feeling like it could be our last stop the next morning. I went back to the river, heart heavy and fists clenched. I found the spot where we'd seen it, hoping to make sense of what happened. The water was still, the surface unmod. There was no sign of anything abnormal, just the calm flow of the river, the rustle of leaves, and the whispering wind. But on the ground, near the edge, was a single, tiny footprint, wet and shaped like a child's, and the sound of a whistle, sharp and low, came from the woods behind me. It was a regular Tuesday when I walked into the office building, just like any other day. The usual hum of fluorescent lights, the sound of people on phones, and the murmur of keyboards filled the air. But there was something different that day, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. The air felt thicker, heavier, almost as if the building was holding its breath. I work in a corporate office on the 14th floor of a 30-story building. My team occupies the west wing, farthest from the elevator, at the end of a long corridor. That day, when I walked to my desk, I noticed something odd, a stack of papers on my chair. I hadn't left any papers there the day before, and when I checked the stack, I saw it wasn't mine. It wasn't from anyone on my team either. At first, I assumed someone must have left it there by mistake. But when I picked it up, I felt the distinct sensation of being watched. I looked around the office. Everyone was at their desks, working as usual. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. I shrugged it off and put the stack on my desk. As the day went on, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. The lights seemed to flicker a little more than usual. The hum of the building had a different quality to it, almost like a low growl vibrating in the walls. I was distracted, but I kept working, pushing the feeling aside. Then came the first incident. It was mid-afternoon when I went to the restroom on the 13th floor. I took the elevator down and walked through the hall. The lights in the corridor were dimmer than usual, and I noticed a strange silence, as though the building itself was holding its breath. I was alone in the hallway, but when I reached the restroom, the door swung open on its own. I assumed it was the wind or an automatic sensor, but when I stepped inside, I was hit with a nauseating smell. It wasn't the usual sterile scent of an office restroom. This one was sharp, like rotting metal, and it made my stomach churn. I was alone in there. No one else was in sight, but I had the distinct impression that someone was standing behind me. I turned quickly, but the bathroom was empty. Nothing but flickering lights above me and the smell that wouldn't go away. I tried to ignore it and finish what I came for, but I felt as though I was being followed out, the sensation of unseen eyes on my back. That night, after work, I stayed later than usual. I had a big project deadline coming up, and I was determined to finish. The building had emptied out by then, only a few of us remained. As I worked, I noticed the temperature in the office was dropping. It felt like the air conditioning had gone on overdrive. My fingers were stiff, and I had to wrap my jacket around me. Around 9 p.m., I finally called it a day. I packed my things and walked toward the elevator. The hallway was eerily quiet, and when I stepped into the elevator, I heard the sound of a door closing behind me. I turned, but there was no one there. The elevator moved down slowly, and I pressed the button for the ground floor. The elevator stopped abruptly between floors, and the lights flickered. I stood there, confused, until I heard something I will never forget, a knock. It came from somewhere behind me in the darkness. 3 distinct knocks on the metal walls. My heart pounded in my chest. I pressed the emergency button, but no one responded. The elevator continued to hum, vibrating ever so slightly. I could still hear the knocking, but now it wasn't just behind me. It was all around me, coming from the walls, from the ceiling, from the floor. Then, I felt a cold breath on my neck. It wasn't the air conditioning. This was something else. My body tensed as I turned, half expecting to see someone standing there, but there was nothing, just the dim light reflecting off the metal walls. The elevator jolted back to life and moved down. When the doors opened on the ground floor, I didn't look back. I rushed out of the building, barely glancing at the lobby. I've never been able to shake that feeling. Something was in there with me. The next morning, I went in early, determined to forget what had happened. I even made a point to take the stairs instead of the elevator. As I walked to my desk, I froze. There, sitting on my chair, was the same stack of papers from the day before, but this time, there was a note on top. "You'll never leave." I've been in that office every day since, but the unease never leaves. The air is always thick, always heavy, and the knocks still echo sometimes, though I can never find the source. I don't know what it is, who it is, but I know one thing for sure. I'm not alone, and I don't think I ever will be again. I work the late shift at a small convenience store on the edge of town. It's a quiet place, usually empty except for the occasional late-night shopper. For the most part, I'm used to the silence, the hum of the fridge, and the occasional flicker of the lights. But one night, something happened that I'll never forget. It was just after midnight when the first strange thing happened. I was stocking the shelves, minding my business, when the doorbell rang. I looked up, but no one came in. I figured maybe the bell was just malfunctioning. These old places always have something wrong with them. But it rang again, followed by the sound of footsteps. I glanced over the counter, but no one was there. I shrugged, dismissing it. There was no one in the aisles either. A quick check of the front parking lot showed nothing out of the ordinary, thus the dim glow of the street lights. As I went back to restocking, the air grew suddenly cold, much colder than usual for the time of year. I rubbed my arms, trying to shake off the unease creeping up my spine. That's when I heard the footsteps again. Slow, deliberate, echoing through the aisles, as if someone were walking in circles around the store. My heart began to pound in my chest. I checked the security monitor, but the footage showed no one. Just an empty store. The store was practically a ghost town at night, and we rarely got customers at this hour. I reached for the phone behind the counter, ready to call the manager, but before I could, a strange voice interrupted my thoughts. It was a whisper, like a breath against my ear. "You can't leave." I spun around, but again, there was no one. No one visible, no one even close. The store was still empty. At this point, I thought I was just overtired. It had been a long shift, and the solitude was getting to me. So, I went to the break room in the back to grab a coffee, hoping it would calm my nerves. When I stepped inside, I froze. The door to the small storage closet was wide open. I knew I had closed it earlier. With my heartbeat pounding in my ears, I slowly walked over and peeked inside. Nothing, just empty shelves and boxes. But then, a sudden shiver ran down my spine as I noticed something odd. A small, nearly imperceptible smudge on the floor. A drag mark, like something heavy had been pulled across the ground and then quickly wiped away. My stomach churned. I quickly shut the door and bolted back out into the main store, but the feeling of being watched intensified. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. That's when it happened. The lights flickered just a brief blink, but it was enough. The moment they came back on, I saw him, a man. He was standing at the far end of the store, by the refrigerated section. He wasn't looking at me. He was just staring at the glass doors, as if waiting for something to happen. I felt my blood freeze. I hadn't heard him enter. No bell, no footsteps. He was just there. I hesitated for a moment, unsure of what to do. But I had to approach him. I couldn't just ignore him. "Can I help you, sir?" I called out, my voice shaking. The man didn't respond. He kept his gaze fixed on the door. I tried again, louder this time, but still no answer. I took a few cautious steps toward him, my eyes fixed on his still form. As I got closer, I realized something was off. His clothes rolled worn out, faded, and his skin had a pale, almost sickly appearance. I reached out to tap his shoulder, but the moment my fingers brushed his coat, he turned toward me, and I recoiled. His face was a blur, distorted, like a bad photograph. It flickered, shifting between different faces. His eyes, though, they stayed the same, hollow and black, staring through me. I could barely breathe. Before I could react, he was gone, vanished, without a sound. I stood there, frozen, my mind struggling to process what I had just seen. I grabbed my coat, prepared to leave. As I stepped outside, I noticed something. A small piece of paper stuck to the door frame. I pulled it off and saw a message written in faded, spidery handwriting. "You can't leave." I drove straight home that night, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles were white. I couldn't stop thinking about the man. Who was he? What did he want? The next day, I went back to work, trying to brush off what had happened as just a bad dream. But when I opened the door to the store, I froze. The same message was written on the door frame. I looked around. Everything else was as it had been. The store was still empty, but the air was different. The silence was thicker now, as if something was waiting, and it hasn't stopped. Every night, without fail, I hear the footsteps. The whispers, I can feel it. That man, he's still here. Watching, waiting, and now ... I'm afraid I'll never be able to leave. I've always worked late shifts at the old city library. The building is massive, a maze of bookshelves and reading nooks, half-lit and musty. I loved it. It was quiet, save for the sound of the pages turning and the occasional hiss of the old, creaky radiator. But it wasn't until the winter storm hit that I discovered how easily something could hide within the shadows. That night, I was the only one there. The wind whistled through the cracked panes of glass, and the lights flickered sporadically. I pushed the thought of getting stuck inside the library out of my mind. I had a shift to finish. The snow piled up against the doors like an impenetrable wall, and I couldn't hear the city at all anymore. It felt like the whole world had gone silent. I stood up from the desk and stretched, looking over the vast sea of books. I made my way down the aisle of history, past the stacks of dusty volumes and the occasional antique globe. It was here, in the quiet solitude, that I noticed something moving out of the corner of my eye. I spun around, but the aisle was empty, just rows upon rows of books, their spines blanketed in darkness. I pushed it aside and continued. But the feeling of being watched grew stronger. I stopped by the reference section, leaning against the oak desk. I swiped my phone out of habit. No signal, of course. The library was a black hole for reception. The sudden jolt of the lights cutting out made me jump. The room plunged into darkness, and I felt a cold breath at the back of my neck. My heart slammed against my ribs, and I stumbled back, eyes searching for a source of the chill. The emergency lights came on, casting a blood-orange glow that made the old, dusty books appear as if they were bleeding. I shivered and tried to steady my breathing, but something didn't feel right. The silence returned, deeper and more suffocating. I swallowed hard, daring to move toward the staff room to check the circuit box. I was halfway across the room when I heard a sharp, wet slap behind me. I spun around, eyes going wide as they locked onto the source, a book, lying open on the floor, its pages moving as if stirred by some invisible hand. The pages whispered, the sound more like a breathing than a breeze. I crept closer, the soft crackling of the old floorboards beneath my feet. The book was open to a page I didn't recognize, a drawing in the margin of a hollow-eyed face with a grotesque grin. The lines seemed to shift as I stared. The eyes blinked, then looked straight at me. The distant creak of a chair moving in the staff room pulled my attention. I took a shaky breath, clutching the book to my chest, and turned to find the door ajar, a deep, unnatural shadow spilling out into the hallway. The scent of damp earth and something rotting reached me as I inched forward. I didn't remember leaving it open. The room was empty, but I noticed the far window, cracked and icy, was now wide open. The wind howled, pulling the pages of nearby books like they were alive. And then I heard a sound like a quiet giggle, sharp and full of malice. My pulse quickened, my skin crawling. In the dim light, I noticed it, a figure just inside the dark, its head too large for its shoulders, grinning wide, eyes empty but fixed on me. I backed up, the book slipping from my hands as I stumbled over my feet. It hit the floor with a thud that echoed like a drumbeat in the silence. Then it lunged. The next moment was a blur. I was out of the library and into the biting wind, not daring to look back, the giggle still ringing in my ears. The snow was so thick I couldn't see more than a few feet ahead, but I ran, faster than I ever had before. When I finally reached the street, the library's lights were out, completely dark. No more orange glow, no more whispers, just the cold and the oppressive silence. The next day, when I went back to retrieve my things, the library was exactly as I had left it, the book lying open on the floor, the page with the face now blank. They never believed me. The others said I was just tired, imagining things. But every time I passed the library, I glanced at the window where I saw it watching me. And I swear it's still there, waiting. I never thought much about haunted houses or strange occurrences. I was always the one to brush off stories, but everything changed during a trip with some friends a few years ago. We decided to rent a secluded cabin for the weekend, far away from any city lights or distractions. It seemed like the perfect escape, peaceful, quiet, surrounded by trees. The first night was fine. We settled in, made dinner, and started telling ghost stories by the fire. I wasn't scared until we heard something strange. Around midnight, after we'd all gone to bed, I woke up to the sound of something tapping on my window. It was a rhythmic, slow tapping, like someone knocking. I told myself it was just the wind or a branch brushing against the glass. But then it happened again, a little louder this time. I felt a chill run down my spine. I got up to check, but when I looked out the window, there was nothing there, just darkness and the rustling of trees. I tried to shake it off, but I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing it, tapping, soft and persistent. Then, a voice, a faint whisper. It said my name, Sarah. I jumped out of bed, my heart racing. I looked around the room, but it was empty, still. The whispering stopped as soon as I looked out the window, but I felt something watching me. I couldn't explain it, but the air felt thick, charged with something I couldn't understand. I stayed awake the rest of the night, unable to shake the feeling that something was out there, something waiting. When morning came, I didn't tell anyone. They'd all laugh at me, and I didn't want to sound crazy. But that evening, as we sat around the fire, one of my friends, Jake, casually mentioned hearing the same tapping the night before. Then, Emma spoke up. She'd heard the whispering too, only she thought it was just a dream. We all went silent. Maybe it's an animal, Mark said, trying to ease the tension. But we were all on edge now, aware of the strange sounds that had plagued us. Later that night, I decided to check the window again. Maybe I could convince myself it was just the wind or something. As I walked to the window, I felt a cold draft sweep across my skin. I pulled the curtain back, but the tapping was there again, like it was coming from just beyond the glass. I gasped, backing away, my mind racing. Then, I noticed something else. There was a shadow moving outside. It was too dark to make out details, but it wasn't the shape of a person, it was too fluid, like it was slithering, creeping around the cabin. I rushed to wake the others. We stood in the living room, staring out the windows, trying to make sense of what we were seeing. The shadow moved in circles around the cabin, and then it stopped right at the front door. There was no knock, just an intense silence that filled the space. We waited, holding our breath. And then, the door creaked open on its own, slowly, as if someone or something had entered. The door wasn't locked. It wasn't supposed to open like that. We rushed to the door, and as we stepped outside, we saw what had been circling the cabin. Footprints. large, uneven prints, leading toward the woods. Something had been out there, watching us, moving around the cabin. But what terrified me most wasn't the footprints, it was the set of prints that led right back to the door. Whoever, or whatever it was, had been right inside with us, watching, waiting. We didn't stay the next night. We packed up quickly and left, too frightened to even consider staying any longer. To this day, I can't explain what happened, but I know one thing for sure: something was in that cabin with us. Something that moved without a sound, waited without a breath, and followed us back home. The question still lingers in my mind: is it still waiting? It started with Adair, my cousin, my best friend, and I were spending the weekend at my uncle's remote cabin in the woods. The cabin was old and creaky, surrounded by dense forest, with no neighbors for miles. My uncle had warned us not to go near the abandoned well out back. He said it was unsafe, but the way he avoided talking about it made it sound like there was more to the story. Naturally, that made it the most interesting thing about the place. After a day of hiking and exploring, the conversation drifted back to the well. My cousin, ever the instigator, dared me to go out there at night and knock on the stones. I tried to laugh it off, but the teasing started. They called me a chicken, and that was all it took. I grabbed a flashlight, stepped into my boots, and made my way toward the well, my friends trailing behind to ensure I didn't back out. The well was in worse shape than I expected. The stones were slick with moss, and weeds grew wild around its base. The flashlight's beam barely penetrated the blackness below, revealing only damp, ancient bricks descending into nothingness. My cousin nudged me, urging me to get on with it. I hesitated, then leaned forward and gave the side of the well a solid knock. The sound echoed unnaturally, hollow and metallic, far deeper than I thought possible. It shouldn't have echoed like that. I straightened up, unease creeping in. Just as I was about to turn away, a faint noise drifted up from the darkness below. It was so faint at first that I thought I imagined it, but then it grew louder. Clearer. It was the sound of someone knocking back. We froze. My cousin laughed nervously, insisting it had to be an echo. But the knocks came again, faster now, more deliberate. It was not an echo. The knocks were uneven, like fingers tapping rhythmically against stone. I turned to leave, but my flashlight caught something near the base of the well. Scratches on the stones, faint but visible, as if someone had clawed at the bricks in desperation. My best friend pointed it out, his voice trembling as he asked if we were sure the well was abandoned. We were all staring at the marks when the knocking stopped, replaced by a new sound. A voice, faint and scratchy, rising from the depths. It didn't sound like a person. It was warped, as if spoken through water, but unmistakably a voice, muttering words we couldn't make out. My cousin grabbed my arm and whispered that it was time to go. We all agreed without hesitation. As we turned to leave, the flashlight flickered, plunging us into darkness. My heart raced as I slapped the side of the light, desperate to get it working again. When it finally flickered back to life, the beam caught something that made my blood run cold. A hand, pale and emaciated, was reaching over the edge of the well. I screamed, and we bolted for the cabin, stumbling over roots and rocks in our panic. We didn't stop until we were inside, locking the door behind us. My uncle wasn't due back until the next day, and none of us wanted to be the one to suggest going outside again to check. We tried to calm ourselves down, convincing each other it had to be a trick of the light or our imaginations. Still, none of us slept that night. Every creak of the cabin and rustle of the wind had us on edge. In the morning, sunlight brought a fragile sense of normalcy. We ventured back to the well in the safety of daylight, determined to prove it was just our minds playing tricks on us. The scratches were still there, as vivid as ever, but there was no sign of the hand or anything else unusual. But then we noticed something chilling. The moss on the stones had been disturbed, long streaks dragged toward the top of the well, as if something had been climbing out. And at the base of the well, leading into the woods, were fresh footprints in the mud. Bare human footprints. I never thought I'd be one to experience something unexplainable. My friends and I were always practical, skeptical, but one weekend trip, far out in the woods, changed everything. We rented a small, isolated cabin, the kind you see in movies where people go to get away, only to encounter the supernatural. I figured it would be peaceful, a quiet place to drink, relax, and forget about the world. We arrived at sunset, the cabin surrounded by trees, the last rays of the sun casting long shadows across the porch. The inside was rustic wooden floors, old furniture. The smell of pine lingered in the air. It felt cozy enough, and we spent the evening unpacking and talking. As night fell, a chill settled in. We gathered around the fire inside, laughing and joking about ghost stories, trying to keep the mood light. But then the wind picked up, rattling the windows. I dismissed it as a typical storm, but my friend Jack seemed unnerved. He kept glancing nervously at the door. "I think something's out there," he muttered, but we all laughed it off. We turned in for the night around midnight. My room was upstairs, at the end of a long hallway. The air was unusually cold, but I chalked it up to the old cabin. As I lay in bed, I heard the soft scrape of something dragging across the floor. I sat up, straining to listen. The sound came again, closer this time, like nails scraping wood. My heart raced. I told myself it was the wind or an animal outside. But then came the sound I couldn't ignore, a tap, light but distinct, on my door. My blood ran cold. "Hello," I called out, my voice barely a whisper. No answer. The wind outside had died down, and all that was left was the eerie silence. I decided to check the hallway. Slowly, I opened my door and crept into the dark corridor. The floorboards creaked under my weight, but the house was otherwise still. I reached the top of the stairs and hesitated. The downstairs was quiet, but there was a faint light coming from the living room. Someone was downstairs. I didn't want to go down, but I had to. Something felt wrong. I tiptoed down the stairs, every step echoing in the empty cabin. As I rounded the corner into the living room, I froze. The fire had gone out, but the room was lit by someone standing near the window. It was a figure, pale and unmoving, staring out into the night. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. Then, without warning, it turned to face me. It wasn't a person. It was a shadow, a mass of blackness that seemed to absorb the light. No face, just a vague outline. It didn't move, didn't speak, it just stood there, watching me. My heart thudded in my chest. I stepped back, my foot catching the edge of the coffee table. The figure didn't flinch, didn't react, but the air grew colder, the silence heavier. I bolted upstairs and slammed my door shut. The entire night, I lay wide awake, heart racing, listening for any sound, but nothing came. No more knocks, no more scraping, just the sound of my own pulse in my ears. The next morning, I didn't want to mention it to my friends. I figured they'd think I was imagining things. But when we all gathered in the kitchen, I saw that Jack looked as pale as I felt. "I heard something last night," he said, voice trembling. "Someone was knocking at my window, and ... I saw something out there, a figure." My stomach twisted. Everyone shared their experiences, and it was clear none of us had slept well. I suggested we leave early, but no one wanted to drive back through the dark woods just yet. So, we decided to stay for one more night. That evening, we stayed inside. None of us wanted to go outside or even near the windows. We ate dinner in silence, the tension thick in the air. As night fell, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that something was waiting for us. Around midnight, we heard the knocking. It started faint, then grew louder, almost as if it was coming from inside the walls. Everyone froze. The sound was relentless, rhythmic, like it was searching for a way in. Then, there was a voice, low and hoarse. "Let me in." It was unmistakable. We bolted out of the cabin and into the car, not even bothering to pack our things. As we drove away, I glanced back through the rearview mirror. The cabin stood there, dark and silent except for the faint, flickering light from the upstairs window. Months later, I looked up the cabin online. The description said it was recently renovated, but the listing had been taken down. I found a local news article from the 1980s about a family that had gone missing near the cabin. They had been staying in a cabin just like ours, but the article never explained what happened to them. It didn't say they were found. I don't know what was in that cabin with us, but I'll never forget the feeling of being watched, the sound of the knocking on the walls, and the voice that wasn't human. Something was in there, and it had been waiting for us to arrive.